So a very warm welcome to everyone who's gathered here today. We're meeting in the virtual world, of course, but nonetheless, we've collected here today for a very important cause from all corners of the globe. Our international range of speakers today are contributing to this event from South Africa, from Egypt, from the US, from the UK. My name is Dia Gupta, and I'm currently past and present fellow Race, Ethnicity and Equality in History at the Royal Historical Society in London. And it is with great pleasure that I'm introducing the first of 6 exciting and important workshops led by the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford. These 6 workshops are part of the Devolving Restitution, African Collections in UK Museums Beyond London project, funded by the Open Society Foundation, Oxford University, and the Art Fund. Our aim with these workshops is not to be prescriptive. We're not trying to lay out a set of institutional principles sanctioned by either the Pitt Rivers Museum or by the University of Oxford. Instead, what we're really trying to do here is to open up a conversation about restitution and the various ways it can take place. We believe that these conversations about restitution should take place with local and international stakeholders. And therefore, we are delighted to have with us today our community partner organization, Oxford Antiracist City, who have helped to shape the day's program and who will be participating in it as well. We're also very pleased to have with us today representatives from the African Foundation for Development, or AFFORD as they are known, who are both contributing to the workshop and running the technical side of things. So thank you, AFFORD. And finally, we are thrilled to have with us not one, but 2 poets. We're very lucky. The first is Inua Ellams, from whom you will hear very soon. And then we have our own poetic chronicler, Mumtaza Mehri, who was commissioned by the organization Poet in the City. And we'll hear from Mumtaza at the end of the day. And in fact, the last word in this workshop will be that of the poet. In each of these 6 workshops, we have a different theme. And today's event centers on the theme of military looting. So one of the purposes of this workshop is to understand collections of African material heritage, which are now in non-national UK museums as a result of military looting. So we will try to consider the contexts from which the objects were taken, how they were taken, and the implication of their continued residence in UK museums. We'll then consider what our next steps should be once these collections have been identified and understood. In practical terms then, this workshop will consist of 2 sessions. Each session lasts approximately 2 hours. So the first session, which is now, will include discussions of collections at the Pitt Rivers Museum and how these objects were taken to Britain. In the afternoon session, we'll consider how to prepare for and pursue restitution of these collections. So here's a brief outline of how the first panel will run. And just to mention a bit about timings. So the first panel runs from 11 to 1 UK time, and the second panel will run from 3 to 5 p.m. UK time. So there's a gap of 2 hours between them. So the first panel will begin with a discussion between Professor Dan Hicks from the Pitt Rivers Museum and Onyeka Chiwambu, the Executive Director of AFFORD. We'll then move on to a presentation by Dr. Marianne Middlecott of the Pitt Rivers Museum on British punitive expeditions in Africa. We'll then play a pre-recorded video with Professor Siraj Rasool from the University of the Western Cape in South Africa. Next, there will be a panel discussion between Shaista Aziz and Deb McLeveen from Oxford Antiracist City, master's student Allegra Aida from the University of Cambridge. Allegra has just submitted her MPhil dissertation, so I'm sure we'll give her a round of applause when she comes on to speak. And of course, Professor Siraj Rasool himself. We'll wrap up this first panel with the poet Inua Ellams' poetic performance, and he will have a conversation with Manchester Museum about his performance. Just a couple of housekeeping points here. Please keep your phones on silent. For those on the Zoom call, when you're not speaking, please do mute yourselves. And when you are speaking, please unmute and put your camera on so we can see you. And as you would have seen right at the beginning, this event is being recorded. Many thanks. And now, before we begin, I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Jeremiah Garsha from the University of Cambridge, who is a cultural historian of violence and collecting. Jeremiah is going to read out an acknowledgement of colonial looting. And this is something we hope will really set the tone for the day. So over to you, Jeremiah.
Thank you. We begin with an acknowledgement. Attendees are drawn together from across the world. In many of these spaces, we have in our possession objects of colonial loot. In many others, we reside on stolen land. We acknowledge that these are areas of forced removal and taking, of looting and genocide. We acknowledge that many of our participants and audience members are part of descendant and survival communities that have suffered and continue to suffer through the unfinished processes of empire. The currents of dispossession continue to enrich others. Whilst we are coming together digitally, this workshop is hosted by Pitt Rivers Museum and is thus situated in Oxford. Geographies of plunder, looting, and violence map onto Oxford. Violence in all of its form and the racism of colonialism endure in Oxford, as it does in countless other cities, both enriched and dispossessed by this history. We therefore acknowledge that many of us have benefited from extractivist imperialism and racist violence. Stolen art, stolen climate, stolen knowledge, stolen ancestors, stolen dignity, and stolen humanity have impoverished as they have enriched the nations, cities, museums, universities, and institutions across the global north. We acknowledge this immeasurable loss, horror, and the enduring harm that the theft of artifacts, culture, and people has wrought. The scale of this violence is immense, remains largely untold, and continues to exert itself upon communities around the world. Indigenous and marginalized communities resisting the processes of cultural domination exported by the global north have been met with killing, displacement, and dispossession. We affirm our solidarity with all those pursuing anti-racism and anti-colonialism, who seek honesty and accountability to provide and assist spectrums of reparations, repair, return, and renewal as we devolve restitution. As we assemble virtually around the Pitt Rivers Museum and Oxford, we hold them, and thus ourselves, to account.
Thank you so much for that, Jeremiah. That was very moving. And I think that really does lay the foundations for the sorts of conversations that we want to be having today. And it's now with great pleasure that I'd like to invite Professor Dan Hicks from the Pitt Rivers Museum and Onyekachi Wambu, Executive Director of Afford, to speak to us. So Dan and Onyekachi, if you want to unmute and show yourselves on the screen, that would be great. Over to you.
Okay, many thanks. So what a wonderful, opening, and absolutely great to have that acknowledgement, which exactly as you say, I hope sets the tone. So I'm not going to talk for all that long, and I'll hand over to Onyekachi in a moment. However, I do want simply to underline a part of the rationale for the day and a part of what we're hoping to get out of it. So as we know, the restitution debate in relation to Africa is advancing fast across Europe and America. But here in the UK, we're finding ourselves not at the moment at the, leading edge of these conversations. And we're learning that restitution sort of lands in a different way in different locations. Here in the UK, we've often hyper-focused on the national institutions. Now, of course, restitution in part is about the relationship in between the formerly colonizing nation and the formerly colonized nations. But it's also a conversation that involves a whole host of non-state actors. Here in the UK, most African objects that were taken under colonialism are not in the national museums. They're in the world culture collections of the regions, of the museum trusts and the university museums, and also the local authority museums. And also, most African objects that were taken are not on display. The vast majority are simply in the storerooms. So here in the UK, the restitution conversation starts with an awareness of what's not on display, and it starts with an awareness that we're talking about the museums in Oxford and Cambridge, in Manchester and Ipswich, in Derby and Belfast, in Edinburgh, and so on. So across the country, there are these really significant, African collections, which are often orphaned collections. They're often in institutions that have suffered undercuts for years, where there isn't an Africanist or even an anthropology curator who's able to lead this work of opening up sort of what's there. But the non-national museums also have certain reasons why they're so important in these conversations. So these are institutions that are often really in touch in a way that often our national museums aren't, with their audiences, with their stakeholders, both locally and internationally, and with the wider community. And of course, they're also institutions that are not subject to the same legal restrictions that some of the national institutions are. So the decisions over restitution, as we've seen recently at Aberdeen, as we've seen in the case of Cambridge, the decisions sit with the trustee bodies. Often they sit with the city councillors. So actually restitution in these contexts has a complexity. And, in my role as a curator, one of the things that I think is really important for those in my position to do, is to move away from an old model of the curatorial authority and to allow this conversation to become an equal process of the co-curation, of having conversations that involve so many who care about these objects, who are not working inside this institution or others like it. So, those of us in museums have a responsibility for transparency, for doing the boring but crucial work of the provenance research that goes into saying what we hold. And also in the context of the theme for today, which is the violent looting of objects from Africa, which of course is only one route, via which objects found their way into museums. And so further workshops will be looking at other contexts, archaeological collecting and ethnographic collecting and so on. But in terms of this history of the military expeditions, these are largely unwritten histories. They're not histories that are well known. So a part of what we need to do in our museums is to recognize the role of these objects as unique indexes for facing up to and reckoning with this history of violence that came in terms, of African history, of the history of the Europeans in Africa. And in facing up to that, we can hope that the meaning of these objects can become more than those histories, but we have to actually talk about those histories at first. So restitution fundamentally is about more than simply the physical return from A to B, although of course that's so important when the demands are made that we're open to that. It's also about knowledge, it's about memory, it's about repair. It's about the dialogues that we have that can lead into meaningful action. It's about the physical dismantling of the white infrastructure of our museums when parts of our histories relate to the history of white supremacy and racism. And it's about the reimagining of our museums as a sort of a site of a conscience in some ways. Fundamentally, it's about those in my position sharing knowledge, but also removing themselves from the conversation. And that's what I hope in the rest of the day we'll be able to achieve. And so over to you, Onikachi.
Thanks, Dan. And it's a real honor to be part of this really important event for Forward. And we welcome everybody who's attending, and also the panelists who are contributing to the day. So why is Forward involved? We began a program called Return of the Icons. And what we've been seeking to do is really to add the diaspora voice to these debates that are going on around this. We, as part of the intervention, the first things that we did was to conduct a research study to look at where the state of the collections were, to explore the viable routes for return, and we identified 4 routes for return, but also as part of that mapping exercise to hear the voice of the diaspora in all of this. We surveyed, as part of a survey that we did, 150 members from the diaspora, and all of them were, the vast majority wanted these artifacts restituted, and they made some other really important contributions to our understanding of how to handle this. At the end of the mapping study, we made 22 recommendations, and some of those Dan has talked about: the need for greater cataloging of the artifacts, and also looking at issues around increasing dialogue with African institutions and partnerships with African institutions, and also just about how we can begin, particularly with the regional museums where the law doesn't impact breakup of collections, different conversations that could now lead to restitution in those institutions. So we have been working with Pitt Rivers as part of that, and we've been really happy to be part of the debates that are going on now around the Devolving restitution program that is now reaching out to regional institutions and to see what is possible there. So Forward is traditionally a development organization that deals with how the diaspora can both support development in Africa. And as Dan said, these restitution issues are now coming in to all kinds of different conversations, even development conversations. Because what we're looking at is why, as Walter Rodney famously said, why is Africa, how did Europe underdevelop Africa? And we understand that a lot of this is linked to longer term issues that emerged out of the Imperial Project. And last week I was having a conversation with some MBA students at the Cass Business School and trying to understand the broader context of development and underdevelopment with them. And I mentioned to them just my own personal story in Nigeria, and I know the Benin bronzes are going to feature in the conversations today, but my own personal story in Nigeria, and we said, look, in the Nigerian context, we, as part of that Imperial Project, we had the period of slavery, and then after that, had this strange interregnum before we started to see the business people coming in around mid-1850s for palm oil now, not for enslaved people. And then the business people were very quickly followed by the military, who came in to enforce what the Royal Niger Company and others were trying to map out in terms of monopoly positions and territory for their business activities. The military were followed by academics and missionaries who came into one set to understand the cultures that they were dealing with, and then the other lot to, as somebody famously said, to steal our minds. And then finally, by the end of the century, by the beginning of the 20th century, the state comes in. So the state, the British state was actually the last major body to come in. And I'm glad that over the next few months, we'll be looking at all those different actors and their different motivations for coming in, and the artifacts that they took in. And part of our work is also to look at the violence that was unleashed. And that's really, really important, because our Return of the Icons project also focuses not just on cultural artifacts, but human remains. And many people during those encounters were taken as trophies and for other reasons as part of the whole eugenic enterprise to study difference. So we had all these different actors, and they're making the interventions. And on a personal level, my community, the Igbo, live a neighboring Benin. And although we didn't have an empire like the Benin or a group of sort of world recognized artifacts in that sense that they had in that collection that were looted after the punitive expedition, we did have a theocratic leader. We didn't have an empire, we had lots of small villages, but what we had was a spiritual leader, a little bit like the Pope, who doesn't, apart from the Vatican, control any territory, but has lots of followers around the world. That spiritual leader was at a place called Nri, and had huge impact across Igbo land. And until the military went in and sacked his palace and brought him out into the public square to basically revoke and turn his back on all the taboos and the religion, the Igbo had not converted more or less to religion. I'm sorry, to Christianity. But following that encounter with the military and the British forces, we converted in mass numbers to Christianity after that institution was destroyed. Some artifacts were taken during the destruction. And so what I'm trying to explain is that the result of some of these military interventions on societies was far-reaching. It fundamentally changed them, it restructured them, and following that defeat of the Ezenri, as we called him, the Theocratic Leader, the men in the community, the Igbo community, were demoralized and really, basically just completely defeated for at least a generation. And it wasn't until 1928, during the Aba women's riots, where the women decided that they were not going to put up with imperial defeat and militarism and resisted British imposition of British hut taxes, that we saw the fire lit again for the independence struggle. And that event in 1928, led by the women, and that resistance was really, really important in relighting the fire for independence and for rethinking, Nigerian culture and our own place in the world after that immense military defeat. So I'm going to end there to say that the military, as one of the players in the imperial projects, have been very important. I'm glad we're going to identify some of the ways that things happened with that particular group of people. I'm glad we're going to explore the implications for the artifacts and other trophies, including human remains that they took during the conversations today. I know that later on in December, there's going to be one of these sessions that focuses exclusively on human remains, but the military also took human trophies, so we should acknowledge that today. And also the violence that was unleashed. I won't go on very much more, but there's going to be, we're going to look at all those issues, but just welcoming everybody, but also explaining some of the reasons why Afford is very passionate about all of this in terms of just understanding how we do what I'm now calling the 10 R's, which is we recognize what happened, we remember the victims, we look at ways for reconnecting and really rebuilding our communities that have been destroyed as a result of all of this. And we look at ideas of how we return and restitute things, that artifacts and human remains that were taken at the time. So I'm going to end there and again thank Dan and Pitt Rivers for the partnership, and we look forward to a day of really interesting and we hope revealing contributions from all our contributors. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Onikachi, and thank you, Dan. I think that really helps us set the context, both the historical context, but also the logistics, and really literally sets our stage for us. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Marianne Middlecott. She's a research with the AHRC and DFG funded project, The Restitution of Knowledge, Artifacts as Archives in the Post-Colonial Museum, 1850 to 1939 at the Pitt Rivers Museum. She's also a research fellow in history of art at St. Peter's College, Oxford, and she's the co-convener of the DAD-funded series, Thinking Provenance, Thinking Restitution. And she'll be presenting today on the restitution of knowledge, punitive expeditions, small wars, and campaigns, 1850 to 1939. And may I also remind everyone to mute themselves, except for you, Marianne, which I would ask you to unmute yourself and turn on your camera so your work in the making. It's always a bit of a vulnerable process. And that was a really excellent presentation because it kind of provides us with the history of looting, but also you've given us all these great images. So we have kind of the materiality of materiality that I think we can follow through with further discussions with our panelists. But first, I had the pleasure about a fortnight ago of sitting down for an interview with Senior Professor Suraj Rasool of the Department of History at the University of Western Cape. And Suraj is the director of the Making Societies, Making Persons Supernatural platform, and he's also the co-principal investigator for the Action of Restitution to African project. And he and I spoke for nearly an hour, and we are going to make that full interview available after this workshop. But for now, I wanted to play just the latter half of the interview, and it's kind of picking up midstream, but we're talking about issues of provenance and return, so it follows quite nicely from Marianne's talk. And specifically, he and I get into ideas of continuing colonial legacies in Britain, and kind of Britain acting as this gatekeeper against the global South. And he has a really excellent point too about the co-option of restitution, and it's kind of a form of neocolonialism. So we're really excited to play it. We'll start playing the interview now. This comes in about 18 minutes into the talk that he and I had, just for keeping time.
Thanks, Jeremiah. I'm going to play the video now.
That's right, or by the lack of display, as we also know. I overlap here, but I wonder if you could kind of unpack for the audience today ideas of histories of violence, landscapes of violence, geographies of violence, and the museum. Are we seeing continuities here? Does the museum conceal? Does it reveal? How does the museum interplay with these ideas of violence?
That's a very beautiful question, Jeremiah, because our concept of museum that we work with and the kind of the ideology that museums have constructed for themselves is that they are institutions of care. They are institutions that have authority to hold, to be entrusted with material culture, with artworks for future generations. And sometimes that ideology of care expresses itself, as you would know, through universalism, that these museums have the responsibility, the sacred responsibility to do so on behalf of the whole of humanity. But what is also interesting is, and is what has really been concealed in that ideology of care, which is expressed in the language of preservation, conservation, of preventive conservation, and all of the technologies and the expertise that are brought to bear in the museum, where museums are always caught in the grip of this contradiction, that they have to care in a way that prevents destruction, which means you've got to keep the object away from the people. and the work of public display and public education, which means you've got to put the artifact on display and give the public access to the document. So museum is always mediating that dilemma, but that ideology, in a sense, of care, I think it conceals the violence with which museums were created. The modern museum was created at a time that coincided with colonialism. And we know from the work of many scholars now, the extent to which museums were not just beneficiaries of colonialism, but were one of the fundamental institutions involved in not just in the colonial project, but in the violence of conquest itself. It is astounding the extent to which that is the case. And so you have the problem of colonial violence being part of what marks a museum in its acquisition of the collection, but also in its continued retention of the artifact in the collection through the ideology of care. In spite of the entire museum sector committing itself to having an ethical practice, to having a practice of care that is rooted in ethics and that is concerned about the ethics of the acquisition of the artifact, that is concerned about looting, about spoliation, about illicit traffic, and that it is very careful to ensure that its hands are clean, but its hands are not clean because of this history and the denial involved. And one of the other problems that we have here is that not all artifacts, artworks, recordings, documentation acquired under colonial conditions were acquired through violence. Because one of the characteristics of colonialism that expresses itself in a settler colonial society is through liberalism. The care of the friends of the natives, the care of the liberals who embark on projects of trusteeship, the trusteeship over things and the trusteeship over people occurred at the same time. The process of indirect rule, the process of assisting colonized people until they reach the stage of development and fruition so that they could govern themselves, has gone now culminated in independence, but the same process has not unfolded in the museum. So you have kind of an incomplete sovereignty in which we have to have a reckoning with liberalism and the way in which these ideologies of care, I think, have expressed themselves in museums. And so the Germans have a project in their provenance research. They are concerned, because of the experience in the Holocaust, of the context of injustice, of the context of violence. And so it is very interesting to see the pressure that the Germans are under when it comes to restitution. But we have a different challenge, that we have the challenge to engage with these ideologies of care, to engage with the existence of liberalism and preservationism in the museum, and to arrive at what a number of scholars, including some of my students like Talia Lubinsky, to talk about a post-preservationist museum, to talk about museums outside of the ideology of care, and how we can rethink the museum as a very different kind of space, a different kind of politics, because that is how you get to the post-colonial, to the decolonial, to the anti-colonial. Colonialism, as it is at its most pernicious, when it presents itself in its caring guise.
Excellent, and that's so well said. And I just have a follow-up on that, which is this idea of collapsing the different routes of collection, right? So there is outright looting, as you've mentioned, but then there is this liberalism, this preservation, this idea of beneficial exchanges, or this idea of this was freely purchased. This in fact was a material that was made for exchange. And I wonder if you do see a division in those, or if the provenance has just become so entangled that we can't really, any artifact that's in a museum is suspect from the get-go because of these histories of colonialism.
Often conventionally in the field of art history, provenance does not even refer to how the object was initially acquired from us in some way, from some person, from some community. Provenance is simply about the aesthetic value of the artifact and of the artwork in different collections. And so you're absolutely correct that the colonial collections in ethnographic museums and in world culture museums today are going through this inquiry into their provenance and into the history of their acquisition, where there is a demand that we go back in time and inquire into what constituted colonialism, what constituted a context of injustice. Was it a naked violence? Was it a violent military campaign? And if it was not, then allegedly that is not a context of injustice. Was it some missionary who acquired collections? And so you've got the problem of the Vatican Museum having all of these collections from all of the colonial territories in which there were missions. That they had massive exhibitions for which artifacts, artworks were acquired. And the question arises, if anything was acquired from any society that was governed by a colonial power, even if it was given as a gift, that artifact should be returned. You're talking about anyone subject to the rule of another under formal colonial power. But I think we also need to go beyond that formality of colonialism and think of the unequal power relations in the world, and think of how it is that collections have been acquired, so that we can apply the fullest understanding of unethical collecting to a broader range of situations of acquisition. And once again, museums would claim that this was legitimately purchased. Here you have the administrative record, and I'm sure you do have collections of that nature. But this is a time in the reckoning with colonial histories when all of these museums need to re-establish their authority over these artifacts, and they cannot rely on a certain kind of history of purchases, because this is a time in which our duty and the work of rethinking the museum is not about caring for the object, but it is ensuring that the object is placed in a relationship with society. Mm-hmm. And that is a new kind of work of doing museums, of making museums, that I think offers such enormous possibility, and that could involve returns, which themselves open up new possibilities for museums.
Excellent. I think actually that, so I have one final, question in this all too brief exchange, and that's, this is what you do in your day job, this idea of inserting yourself into this and advising these institutions. So you talked a little bit about Germany's kind of, special path to restitution, maybe we can call it, based on their Holocaust legacy. And we see Britain kind of moving at in a different pace to its kind of continental counterparts, and obviously to museums and settler societies, and in the post-colonial world. So I wonder if you have a piece of advice for Pitt Rivers itself, British museums, or even European museums regarding their current policies, regarding ideas of restitution or conversation that you'd like to leave us with.
It's very difficult for me to give advice to British institutions. I mean, I've only been to Britain 2 or 3 times in the last 15 years. So I have, even though some of my family come from Britain and all of that, I feel very cut off from Britain because of the visa that was imposed on South Africans when we became free. It's easier for me to go to continental Europe, to go to Germany, to go to the Netherlands, where I speak the language, and where, it's easier for me to go to travel in the Schengen zone. But I follow developments in Britain very closely. I follow, I get to live in Germany from time to time, and I follow events in Germany very closely. And I am on different boards and different advisory committees, and sometimes get to meet with the German Foreign Office and get to meetings arranged by the Goethe Institute. Our German colleagues are extremely busy with incorporating culture into their their international relations system. Culture is at the apex of what they do internationally. Unlike Britain, the work of the British Council is simply based on thinking that they need to export British expertise. But the weird thing is, I was asked to give a keynote address to the Commonwealth Association of Muslims last year, just before lockdown, and I had to tell them, the Commonwealth is not something to be inhabited. It's something to be questioned, something to be challenged, and the Commonwealth is a colonial legacy that we really don't need. But I certainly follow how it is that small museums are doing. Pitt Rivers, Horniman are doing very important work in trying to do reconnection, in trying to do provenance and inventory making for the purposes of being open to restitution. I think there's some very important thinking, very important work that is taking place in recognizing histories of violence, in collecting, and at the same time, you see what happens when the state intervenes and feels threatened, and where you have larger museums adopting this position of retain and explain, of holding on to collections for the societies of the world. And I think that what needs to happen is that, museums like Pitt Rivers, Horniman, and other museums in other parts of Britain, they need to continue doing the work, the excellent work that they are doing as part of the building up of pressure. What we have learned from Germany is that what is also needed is the presence of activism, the presence of activism alongside the work that museums do. We see this work of activism in the hashtag Black Lives Matter work that has happened around the monuments that have celebrated owners of enslaved people. But I think we need a greater degree of activism around museums that hold collections from African societies. And that is something that I would like to see. The work of, Berlin Postkolonial and the activists in Germany, I think, have speeded up the transformations that you see in Berlin, in Germany, that have led to the negotiations just last week by a representative of the Department of Foreign Affairs, by Hermann Partzinger and Barbara Blankensteiner and their team, extremely well publicized, and the return of Benin bronzes to Germany. What we are possibly witnessing is a new kind of neo-colonialism, of a neo-colonialism that embraces restitution, alongside of which has come a new museum studies program called the Museum Lab, in which German expertise presents itself as wanting to do partnerships with Africans and wanting to do training. And so you've got a kind of a new kind of soft power operating there that is very new and that we need to think about. And you know, these discussions are happening at the same time as, you would know, the announcement that has just been made that Germany has now accepted that the killing fields of German Southwest Africa at the beginning of the 20th century constituted a genocide, and that they have put a financial sum, which they call reparations, or which is called development assistance, that will be given to the German state to spend in the regions of the communities whose descendants were murdered on such a mass scale. But you would know that it has just stopped short of being reparations, and that our comrades in Namibia are unhappy, and the activists are gathering today in Berlin outside the venue of the famous Berlin conference, and that, you know, these are ongoing struggles. So I think one must worry about simply regarding Germany as a successful case and Britain as not a successful case. You know, at the same time in South Africa, we are awaiting the visit to South Africa by Emmanuel Macron. And the South Africans, so this isn't a moment where the South Africans are going to associate Macron with the possibility of a restitution of material culture and artworks in museums. This is a time when the South Africans are concerned about the murder of Galsi September in Paris, and the extent to which the French government is going to start taking responsibility for finding the killers of Galsi September. So, you know, the thing about this field of restitution is that it requires that we work in our own African societies, that we establish African forms of solidarity and alliance as we work together in our different countries, colonized as differently as we have been. But we also, as Africans, have to be experts on what is happening in Europe, because we cannot leave this simply to the Europeans. This needs to be an African-driven process. And it's, of course, we have the cards stacked completely against us, because we can't just travel in Europe as we like. I'm not allowed to go to Britain any longer. My visa has expired. I mean, apart from the restrictions of the lockdown. And maybe I will, you know, bite my lip and undergo the humiliating experience once again of paying a huge amount of money. The value of an international flight to apply for a visa for 2 years to enter Britain again. It is a situation of such utter disrespect that we are in, that you know, it is such a difficult situation to actually do this kind of work.
Well, you've left us with much to be concerned about, but also a fair amount of hope, right? You know, in this idea that, you know, how can we come together as activists, as scholars, as community members and make sure that, you know, we're doing our best to make things right. And it's a long process, it's a slow process, but I hope it's a process that gives everyone much to believe in and much to hope for. And thank you so much for helping lead it that way. So let's conclude it for now. Thank you again, Suraj. That was just an absolute pleasure. And I learned so much. I think there's much more to be said, and hopefully the workshop can pick it up from there.
Thank you very much, Jeremiah, and all my best for the workshop.
So that was truly incredible. I hope you enjoyed that interview as much as I did. I was particularly struck by Siraj's talk of the post-preservationist museum. Really intrigued by that, really interested to know how we can get there. And also by his ideas about the museum itself as an activist space. So we'll hear more from Siraj and others now, because we're going to start our panel discussion. We have about half an hour or so for the panel discussion, so that's plenty of time. And so let me just introduce you to our panelists. We're going to talk here about the themes that have already been discussed, but also about the nature and practice of restitution. And for this purpose, I'm very pleased to be introducing and Deb McLeveen from our community partner organization, Oxford Antiracist City. Shaista is the founder of Antiracist City Oxford and an Oxford City Councillor, and she's accompanied here by her colleague, Deb McLeveen. So Shaista and Deb, a very warm welcome to both of you. Please do unmute yourselves and reveal yourselves on the screen. Thank you. We also have Allegra Aida, who has had just submitted, as we heard earlier, her MPhil dissertation. She did her MPhil in African Studies from the University of Cambridge, and she's going on to Yale to do her PhD. Her research focuses on the Warri Kingdom, which is in the Niger Delta region of Nigeria. So very warm welcome, Allegra. Please reveal yourself and unmute yourself. And then I'm going to hand over to Jeremiah to do the other introductions.
Yeah, anyone who's aware, you'll also see that Suraj has joined us here live, and he'll be part of the panel as well. And for the structure of this panel, we're essentially going to do a roundtable. So we're going to circle around our panelists in kind of a set order, starting with Shaista, and then we'll move to Deb, Allegra, and Suraj, and then we'll come back again to Shaista and do the circle again. So with everyone unmuted and with their cameras on, I'll leave it over to you, Shaista, to begin the conversation.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Well, it's good afternoon, I should say. First of all, thank you to everybody who's been involved in organising this space. I think it's extremely important this is happening. I found the discussion between you, Jeremiah, and Suraj to be brilliant. So thank you for that as well. Really, I just want to start off by introducing Antiracist City as a concept and what we're about, but also just to acknowledge that we're holding this discussion a year to the day when thousands of Oxford residents took to the streets a year ago. They were standing in front of the Cecil Rhodes statue. And it was the first time as someone born and raised in this city that I've seen the town in the gown meeting in this way. To take anti-racist action collectively together. I thought it was a very poignant, moving and powerful moment. And I would like us to develop more of those powerful moments and turn them into a movement. I think there needs to be closer proximity between the town and the gown. And I think the gown needs to understand that the violence that we've been talking about in relation to colonialism and the museum space is not just situated in the museum, or it goes beyond the museum, and violence manifests in many different ways, as we know. So just a brief introduction to Antiracist City Oxford. So this platform was set up around about 3 years ago. It was basically set up when the Brexit was well, Brexit has been in formulation for a long time, as we know, but leading up to the Brexit vote, there's been a massive rise in reported hate crime in this country, and there's been a mainstreaming of racism racism has always been mainstream in Great Britain, but there's been a further mainstreaming of racism in relation to this political project. So this project was set up, Anti-Racist City. The point of it is to open up space, create safety for dialogue and discussion, and then action to develop on anti-racism. And what we found, there's a small group of us that were doing this work, 3 women basically. What we found was that people were very desperate to have these conversations and to enter spaces where they could talk about racism. And overwhelmingly, what we found was actually it was white men, working class white men and middle class white men coming together who really wanted to talk about how racism manifests and how they understand racism, which perhaps is not what people would expect. But I think this goes to the heart of the work that needs to be done, and it goes to the heart of the challenges that we are facing daily in this country and in this city, whereby there is no safety and there is no space. We know in the past 24 hours there's been this a lot of anger that's been emerging around being an anti-racist. We've got the Prime Minister no less defending racist tweets from the members of the national English cricket team. We've got stuff going on with our national football team, and then we've got this whole debacle unfolding around Oxford College and it removing a portrait of the Queen. So we've got a lot of hysteria and we've got a lot of disinformation and misinformation, which is not new to anybody who's been doing this work. But what we do know is that we have to work harder to create dialogue and discussion and safety, because when we do that, things start changing. So just very briefly, what we are is we're an intersectional platform. We are made, or we are, the executive committee is teachers, trade unionists, activists from all backgrounds, primarily people born and raised in this city who've been locked out from the gown. As someone who's from this city, I do not feel Oxford, when I go into the centre of the city, I don't see it reflects us. I do not see it reflecting the wider city. We have one of the most diverse racial populations in the Thames Valley region. We've got Slough, which is not very far from Oxford, and Reading, which has a very large multiracial population. But actually Oxford has got one of the largest multiracial populations when it comes to this region, but you don't see that being reflected anywhere either. So what we've been doing for the past year in particular, since the reinvigoration of the Black Lives Matter movement, is we've been holding discussions called Uncomfortable Conversations, and we've held these discussions on a number of different issues. So for example, how do I raise, as a white person, how do I raise mixed race children, for example? We've debated, what does Black Lives Matter mean? Why do we need that movement? Last week we looked at Palestine and Israel and looked at the synergies between anti-colonialism and movements around the world and what's happening there. So we are very much looking at the national, the local, the national and the international. We see all of this interconnected. We've had an incredibly powerful response so far. We've also been dragged into some debates and discussions from other groups in the city who are contesting, who gets to speak on anti-racism. And I think this is also really important. I think that we can never have one homogenized voice. We should be looking for plurality. We should be looking for multiple voices to emerge. But the bottom line is that for too long, in my opinion, anti-racism is, and people who profess to be anti-racist have become part of the gatekeepers who close access to space, particularly very privileged space, such as the space that is the gown and everything that comes with it. So I don't really look at Oxford as colleges, I look at it as an institution. And to be fair, I think most people outside of the city and outside of the institution look at it as an institution as well. So this is the kind of work we've been doing, and what we're keen to do with Pitt Rivers and Afford is to further open up space and to invite as many people as possible to come and to be part of this discussion. But what we also really urgently want to see is we want to know how we're going to transition from these types of discussions to action, and how we're going to create an anti-racist city. Because we cannot create an anti-racist city if the gown continues in the way that it is. It needs to start listening and engaging fully with the people of our city. So I'll stop there and hand over to you, Debs, if that's okay. Jeremiah, if you want to do it in a different way, please step in and that's.
No, this is great.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Shaista, for that excellent introduction. It fits in well with what we want to talk about. And I'd also like to thank all the other contributors today, because it's been really interesting, and it's critical conversation for how, especially for us from Antiracist City, who want to work with Pitt Rivers, because what we want is change. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about why this work has to be anti-racist work. It has to be framed, we believe, in an anti-racist approach. Without that, we cannot succeed. And although, for example, in this country, we have legislation that requires institutions, public bodies must not discriminate. It's been weakened over, over more recent years, but, there's a public duty to promote or to prevent and eliminate discrimination, all of that sort of thing. So we have actually a bit of law, but we know that law doesn't make institutions change or do anything. However, I do think it's important that when we're framing all of this, that's one of the kind of levers or things that cannot be changed. However, we want practice, not bits of paper. And I think that's one of the things that all of us probably have experienced this in different ways, but in this country, we've had equalities, legislation, etc., practice, and I think it's really important, the issue that Shyster has raised, which is that we now have a really divided country, and we have such extreme hatred being dished out here, and it's not dished out, it's actual physical violence, murder. So actually, we are experiencing what was going on then, here now. And as Shyster says, the institution is at the heart of it. And without changing the institution, and so our work for an anti-racist city, we want to change institutions. Now, how fantastic. We've come across Pitt Rivers, and people at Pitt Rivers want to work with us to change this. So that's our starting point. And I think it's really important to emphasize that. However, change cannot be achieved, we really believe, without having anti-racist, not just policy, but practice, which is what this discussion this morning has been really interesting for me, because I'm learning more about it all the time. And so in preparing this little presentation or this tiny discussion point, what we're very keen to do is to pick up on some of the important issues that have already been mentioned this morning. But whose history is it? Well, we very much believe in the town, even though the university is a massive institution that we're not part of. Actually, it is our history, and it's the history of people living in our city. It's the history of people living in where all of you are living on this panel. So it's all of our history. But of course, whose history do we hear about, and whose history is presented? Not our history. So what we are passionate about is working to elicit and find people's history, because we have descendants of slaves here, we may have descendants of soldiers, we'll have descendants of all sorts. Now I'm talking about ordinary people's lives, because that is our history. So, okay, you've got the high ups. This is the other thing about the institution. It isn't just about racism. It is about class, and it is about power, all the things that have already been mentioned. But this is a piece of work that has the potential to chip away at all those different levels of power. But unless we chip away and make those connections from the things we've already heard people talking about the links between colony, empire, migration, immigration, class, they're burning issues now. They're killing and hurting people in society now, certainly in this country, and I'm sure in other countries. So that's why we think this is a really important piece of work, but this only has to be a starting point, because how do we achieve these many layers of history and change, but also institutional change in our practices? So it's looking at, it's so many layers. So for example, we're hearing about bits of research. Well, where's the research methodology that ensures anti-racism is embedded anti-racism within academic research? we've already talked, or we've had conversations already with people from this team and the Pitt Rivers, which are really useful, about, and other people have talked about this today, about how we present the information. War loot. Like, for many of us, what is war loot? Unless you're an academic, you have no idea. But actually, war loot is the most horrendous, you know, has many horrendous stories behind it. But we, in the Pitt Rivers, as we've heard this morning, get to hear one story. So our passion and work is about how we elicit history and restore power. But I'm going another point, actually, just jumping slightly, because I'm sure I'm probably running out of time. Obviously, we need political commitment. We need a lot of work being done, like the work we're doing, but we need the resources to involve others. If we want this to be meaningful, we have to engage with other people's histories. And to do that actually requires a lot of work and resources, but it also requires leadership from the top. So I'm just throwing in many of the layers now. We need materials to take to the children in schools, or to take to elders in our communities who may well be very interested and have important connections with this work. But actually, we need a lot of resources to be able to do that. However, I'm going to kind of wrap up a bit now. I think really this is just, for us, this is just the starting point. And as I say, I've identified some of the things that we need to change, and hopefully recognize that we need this change to happen on many different levels. However, and I think there's hope actually in this, because we are beginning to explore these different levels, but without taking on the many different levels of power, and we won't, you know, we can't do anything. Finally, actually, restitution, off the top of my head, and my instant reaction to the word restitution is actually that but I might be treading on difficult ground here, but I quickly Googled it. But I don't want to restore things. We can't, like, why do we not, we don't, like, okay, you can give back objects, but we can't restore. In many ways, it's difficult. The how of restoration is very, very challenging for me. And I think I just want complete and utter change and anti-racism. In fact, I would go for framing all of this really in human rights. That has to be the bottom line, and rights, unless we have some understanding of human rights really, and stick anti-racism within that, I think we won't get very far. And that addresses many of the issues of violence, you know, the violence, theft, and all of those different things. And the way we need to hear the voices of those affected at many levels, and how it makes them feel, what they think about it, and then listen to what they want to do about it. And together we can do that. Thank you.
Thanks, Deb, and that's really great. And we do have Oxford Anti-Racist City with Shaista and Debs joining us again in the afternoon session as well, so we can continue these trajectories. Allegra, if I can turn it over to you now.
Great, thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's so wonderful to be a part of this excellent panel. And I just wanted to contextualize a bit what I'm talking about by introducing myself just a little bit more. So my name is Allegra Oshaye Ejurewa Aida, and I'm Nigerian. I'm a Nigerian that lives in diaspora, and I'm also Shekiri, which is a minority ethnic group within Nigeria. And my research, which focuses on the Warri Kingdom, that's the homeland of the Shekiri people. So, but today what I want to talk about is a less well-known example of looted cultural heritage, because what's evident is that we hear a lot about the Benin bronzes, but there are also, as has been elucidated, lots of examples of looted cultural heritage throughout the United Kingdom. So I'm just going to share my screen just so I can show, some images. So I can show a few images as I speak, just to give everyone something visually to look at. So my master's research, which I just finished today, focuses on Chief Nana Olomu, who is an influential Shekiri chief who was active in the late 19th and early 20th century within the Warri Kingdom. And what he's most well known for is his opposition to British rule, which culminated in the Ebrahimi expedition, which was a punitive expedition carried out by the British against Nana between July and October 1894, which ended in Nana's defeat and exile to the Gold Coast. But he eventually returned from exile in 1906 and founded his own village called Koko, which is still in existence today. And he also built a palace there where he was buried. And this palace has become the Nana Living History Museum, which manages the largest collection of Chief Nana's personal effects. And so the Ebrahimi expedition was this really defining moment in Chief Nana's life, and it's intimately linked to his name and legacy. And the expedition was widely publicized, both in British and Nigerian newspapers, also in South African newspapers as well. So this is just an example of an article from the Lagos Weekly Record, dated September 8th, 1894, which sort of does a play-by-play account of what was happening. And so what I wish to talk about is how, following Nana's capture and trial, all his possessions in his armory were gathered and auctioned off to pay for the expenses of the British Navy. And we've already heard about this looting earlier. And so it's these objects I wish to follow briefly in the next 3 minutes, as they ended up 3,000 miles away in the UK at the Maritime Museum in Greenwich. And so the way, as of June 2021, out of the 6 objects which are in the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, London, only one of the objects is on active display, which is the boat gun. The remaining 5 objects, which includes this flag, Nana's personal flag, are in storage. And so the way that Western institutions create objects they possess has been coming under intense scrutiny, as we all know now, with all these articles about the need to restitute objects. And I believe that sort of the power that museums have to represent different objects and cultures to a wider audience means that museums really need to sort of take ownership of what they're doing, because what you have is, when you have these objects and the way they're labeled, these descriptions often are incomplete. And what they do is they flatten the history of these objects. And by flatten, what I mean is that it's sort of simple, all these objects become simplified. Like this flag here on the screen is just called Shekiri flag. And if you didn't know that it was Chief, I mean, it says Nana on it, but the flag isn't labeled to sort of suggest that it belongs to Chief Nana, or the history of how the object ended up in the Maritime Museum. And so what these objects aren't, what you have happening is that these objects don't exactly reflect how these objects move through time and space. Sorry, I said objects a lot. So lastly, just to finish off, a very brief example of what can go wrong when something is really mislabeled. So this flag is called the 1897 Benin Expedition. And the problem is that this flag isn't from the Benin Expedition. In fact, this flag is of Shekiri origin. And the reason we know that is because, firstly, the Shekiri used flags more than the Benin Empire ever did, because the way the Shekiri are is that they're riverine people, and they use the creeks of the Niger Delta a lot for trade, and also for trade and transport and everything else. And the color of the flag, this scarlet red, this is very important for in terms of Shekiri cultural heritage, because the scarlet red, the scarlet and the white are symbols of Shekiri royalty. And so the reason I think this flag was mislabeled is because a lot of the Benin River, which flows through the Warri Kingdom, leads to Benin City into the Benin Kingdom, but it's actually part of the Warri Kingdom. And so what happens is, because it's called the Benin River, people think it's related to the Benin Kingdom, when in fact the Warri Kingdom is there. And so sort of to end this point, I just want to say that in terms of the repatriation of African cultural heritage, the current conversation focuses on looted Benin bronzes and the sort of violent history of their removal from the Benin Kingdom. What I've briefly shown, and I'll talk about a bit more later on, is how Chief Nana's objects, which were also looted in a punitive campaign, should also be entering this conversation. What differs in Nana's cultural heritage compared to the Benin bronzes is that we know who these objects belong to. They belong to Chief Nana and his descendants. And Nana himself had around 100 children, and his descendants are involved in the running of the Nana Living History Museum in Cocoa, and they're also scattered throughout the globe as far as California. I myself am descended from Chief Nana as well. I'm a great grandniece, I believe. I need to double check the family tree. And what I hope is that, what I believe is that it's not right for these objects to sort of be languishing in storage where they have somewhere to go. And it's my opinion, and I'm sure it's shared by many Shekiri people, that these objects should go back home. Thank you.
particularly great. Hopefully that opinion is shared by everyone, actually, and really does remind us that we can't let Benin bronzes dominate our conversation. Suraj, can we pick up with you now?
Certainly. Yeah, thank you so much for this excellent panel. I sit, in a sense, on the banks of the Lisbek, which is the river in the neighborhood of Cape Town, where I live, which also holds, it's called Observatory, and it's also the site, the location of, I suppose, what's called the first scientific institution in the Southern Hemisphere, an observatory that is still a working observatory. And that is also kind of on the slopes of Devil's Peak, which is attached to Table Mountain, and you will know exactly where I am because it's also the location of the Grote Schuur Hospital, site of the so-called first heart transplant that many people know about. But this is also the location of the allocation of the very first plots of land to the so-called free burghers by the Dutch East India Company. And it's the location of one of the first anti-colonial wars that took place in the 17th and 18th centuries, because the landscape of the Lisbek River and the wetland area that makes it up were the commonage of the local Khoisan people, our ancestors, the Goring Haikona, who were dispossessed of land when those land allocations took place. And as I sit here, we are in the middle of a heritage war, because the land has been earmarked for development, with the apex tenant being Amazon, that is going to develop one of its locations there. And all of this has happened through environmental impact assessment and heritage impact assessment, where ultimately heritage is merely a compensatory means of supporting capitalist development. And so what has been offered in its place is a kind of a micro museum of indigenous history that some of the Khoisan leaders in our area have accepted, and which some have rejected, and have argued that this is a very important landscape. So what I'm saying is that when we think about restitution, in other words, when we think of addressing the violences of the past that continue to exist today, we need to think of the relationship between the politics of restitution and the contemporary politics of land. And of course, our first usage in South Africa after 1994 of the idea of restitution, alongside the many restorative notions that emerged in a reconstructing South Africa with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the transformation of museums and so forth, was of course the restitution of land to dispossessed people. And these are ongoing struggles of land restitution, urban forms of land restitution, rural forms of land restitution. And of course, land restitution is so incomplete and it is so problematic because it set a cutoff date, by which a dispossession was claimable. And so there is so much dissatisfaction and so much unease about the way in which restitution has been turned into a domain of really inadequate governmentality. My family comes from an area just up the road called District 6, which is one of the famous locations of forced removals under apartheid in South Africa. And I went to school in District 6. and was able to witness the removals under the Group Areas Act in front of my eyes. I myself was very lucky. My family was spared being removed because my family moved out of District 6 and into Woodstock when they became middle class and when they became English speaking and sort of started frowning at the Afrikaans language that was somewhat of their background. And so it's land restitution is a very important process. And one of the arguments that we made in the District 6 Museum, which I worked in as a trustee and as an active trustee for more than 20 years, was that land restitution must not be thought of as simply a restoration of property. When you think of land as property to be negotiated and to be demarcated, to be measured and to be named and claimed in that way, you have a recipe for disaster. And in the District 6 Museum, we made an argument why restitution is a project of the restoration of humanity. Land restitution is preeminently, if it is anything else, it is a restoration of a cultural connection with the land. Of course, there were elements of this conceptualization of this politics of restitution that was, I suppose, a little, this was like dreaming about what restitution could mean. It was about dreaming about building a future based on the values of the past, in which the work of the museum identified what the community values were of this diverse District 6 community that experienced this forced removal. But it argued that the land is not just property, the land is landscape. And landscape is imprinted with meaning. And so when you think of a land to be restored and to be healed, of a healing process involved, that is not just about the return of property to claimants. You have a very different kind of project. And now we are thinking about connecting the restitution of art, material culture, human remains, documentation, to a politics of restitution over landscape, and how that is connected to other forms of the remaking of humanity, the remaking of humans and persons in a society that is trying to recover from the ravages of the past, where that you can never, in a sense, do a real restitution. You can never return to the place from which you were removed. And so you can never experience a restitution of the artwork and of the object in a real sense of what it was before. And this opens up an enormously fruitful area of creativity, we know from the work that other scholars have done, that Savoy and others have made an argument about an ethics of humanity. We are hearing, even in the midst of the provenance projects and the co-curatorship projects in Germany with Namibian colleagues and so forth, what emerges when Namibian curators encounter these Namibian objects in these German collections. So this ability of the object to perform a restoration of personhood is something that we need to think about and take very seriously, because these aren't dead objects. They are objects that have life. They themselves are ancestors. And one of the arguments that we have been making is that our discussions of the restitution of material culture and the restitution of human remains have been artificially separated from each other. because the collecting histories and the histories of violence have often meant that these kinds of phenomena were collected together, were looted together, were disinterred together, were acquired immorally together. And we need to think about restoration. We need to think about what that means. We need to have an engagement with the field of restorative justice without lapsing into the technical ways in which transitional justice and restorative justice have placed projects in the hands of experts so that you've had a different kind of dispossession. Of course, you need expertise. You need expertise in this process. You need scholarly research and so forth. But as our colleagues have argued, this is also a moment where we have to deconstruct the academy. We need to think about expertise in different ways. And the biography that I come from in District 6 was about not just the biography, not just the history of dispossession, but this is an apartheid history of being excluded from the educational institutions, where those educational institutions were formed in liberalism and where they were created and where they thought that their project was to do a form of uplift, of social uplift, in the case of a place like District 6. So you have whole disciplines of social work, of urban sociology, of anthropology, of social anthropology that emerged and occupied this field of uplift and of dispossession, in a sense. And so there is so much to think about here, but we need to be able to make those connections so that restitution is not a separate elite field of organized returns with the African Union involved and left up to governments. Of course, they have to be governments that have to do negotiations, but this is about rehumanization of people. This is about remaking ourselves.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Okay, I think we're having a bit of technical difficulty at your end, Siraj. So if I can just come in there. We're running rapidly out of time. We want to showcase to you our poet as well, but very briefly, because we wanted this panel to have a bit of exchange between all of you. Very briefly, if I can take you round the table, as it were. I know there is no table. We'll just go round in the order I say it. And very briefly, perhaps in a sentence, if there's something that a panelist has said that has really struck you and chimed and resonated with you, can you very briefly in a sentence tell us what that is? So I'm going to go around in the same order we went before. So Shaista, if you would like to come in very briefly, please.
So I would say, Siraj, your contribution is always brilliant. And I think this notion of returning to humanity, I think is essential. And, Debbie and I've just exchanged a message on WhatsApp in relation to what you've said. And Debbie, your point about linking this also to the environment and, bringing our humanity back in relation to how we're treating the planet as well. And then the final thing I'll just quickly say is the other thing, the key thing that resonates for me is we cannot, Oxford is a city, Gowan is a place which is over obsessed with intellectualizing everything, and it's used to mask many horrors, and we cannot allow that to continue. We need to disrupt that urgently. Thank you.
Thanks, Shaista. Debs, if we could have you next, please, in a sentence.
Yes, I'm very excited by the restoration of humanity, as Shaista has just said. I really like that idea and the connections with the earth. I also really welcome all the different contributions. I know I've said that, but it is so important that everyone on this panel, and I'm sure lots more people, because bringing together these different aspects, and also that this is very much about a start and change. So thank you, everyone, and I hope we achieve something.
Thanks so much, Debs. Allegra?
Oh no, so excellent panel all round. And just to briefly touch on this idea of over-intellectualizing, I think as someone who's just sort of spent hours writing and rewriting, and then you sort of spend a lot of time looking at documents, and then you have to realize that like my research, for example, I'm looking at these objects are living, as Professor Russell was saying, that these are sort of, I talk about this living history museum in Cocoa, and just this idea that we can't just sort of, it's not just about what we write and what, we can't just overthink everything. We do have to just sort of take action, and there's things to be done. And it's great that this panel is just a step in that direction.
Wonderful. Thank you, Allegra. Siraj.
Yeah, I suppose I'm interested in the issues that have been referred to as sort of town gown issues, and the relationships that universities have with communities and societies, and how we need to completely rethink that relationship as a unidirectional one of uplift and of outreach and so forth. And these universities require the activism around them, the social activism. The social activism is required by within those universities, because right now these universities are, they are fields of struggle. There is a struggle taking place over whether roads should come down, whether roads should face forward or backwards, or like a naughty schoolboy, as someone said recently. And these are struggles that have to take place. And I know that Oxford is also the site of enormously important intellectual histories that are not academic, in the sense that they are not from the university. There's a history of labor colleges. There's a history of, in the sort of people's history movement, there are a very important, I think, legacies that I think need to be built upon here. Because also, I mean, the trouble with places like Oxford and Cambridge, I would imagine, is that they generate a relationship with society that is constituted through charity and through charitable expressions. Now, of course, we know that even those charities are fighting for their lives right now, and there are all kinds of struggles taking place. But this is not about charity. This is about about people taking authority over the fundamental debates in society, so that one constitutes a restitution movement in and around Oxford that is about restoration, and that doesn't just leave it up to the curators in Pitt Rivers, as much as we love them, but that supports them, and that gives them a means of making a stronger argument for the work that they do in the institutions that they inhabit.
Thank you so much, Siraj. I think that's a fantastic note with which to end our panel discussion. And I'm glad we could give you a little sliver of time to be able to talk to each other. It wasn't much. We hope to be able to continue these important discussions. I hope now that we finished the panel discussion, I'm going to hand over. I hope you're really looking forward to listening to our poet. So Jeremiah, would you like to introduce our poet?
Yes, of course. I'll keep it actually quite brief. I think Inua can speak for himself, but we have Inua Elams and Campbell Price here. Campbell has kindly jumped in for Esme Ward, who sends her apologies. I think Inua will be known to most of us here. He's a poet, playwright, a curator. And then Campbell is the curator of Egypt and Sudan at the Manchester Museum. And the Manchester Museum is hosting our next Devolving Restitution workshop on the 13th of October. So over to you two.
If I can jump in to introduce you, Inua, I don't think we ever met at your performance, because I was actually in Egypt. And as Jeremiah said, Esme Ward, the director of Manchester Museum, is sorry not to join us, but sends her best wishes. And she wanted me just to share some thoughts about the Tusk, which obviously your poem, Inua, responded to, and say something about the return of this and other material that we currently have from Benin, and to support restitution more widely. So if I just share a screen, I will show you the tusk, which is the subject. So the tusk was looted by British soldiers, part of, as we have already heard, the bloody 1897 punitive expedition, during which Benin City was destroyed and Oba Ovonramwen, the ruler of the Edo people, was exiled. Now, Inua Elam's poem, commissioned in 2019, really marks time. The tusk has been in Salford, then in Manchester since 1898, 123 years of holding on to something that we knew was stolen. Now, for at least 25 of those years, the museum has been asked about the objects it holds from Benin, and tireless and careful work by activists and by researchers has built the case for return. There will be no more years of holding on and holding back. We believe that it's not a question of if, but when the tusk will return, and we're talking to peers in Nigeria and audiences here in Manchester about what happens next. So when Manchester Museum reopens fully in 2022, it will be full of many wonderful objects, but not this one. So Inua Elams was born in Nigeria in 1984, an excellent year. I was born then too, so we're of great vintage. He's based in London. He's an internationally touring poet, playwright, performer, graphic artist, and designer. In 2019, as I said, he was commissioned by the Manchester City of Literature and Manchester Museum to respond to this tusk from Benin. So it is my great pleasure to introduce you, Inua.
Thanks, Campbell. I wrote a 7-part poem in response to the tusk. And I wasn't sure it was going to be that long when I started writing, but after weeks and weeks of intense research, I found a way to tell a 7-part story narrative that drew strands through the legacy of colonialism. And I'm going to read 4 parts of the 7-part poem. The poem itself is titled "Fuck Empire." Excuse my use of profanity. And this is part 3, 4, and 5. Part 1 details the Opium Wars in China between the British Empire and the attempts to sell opium, and the emperor's attempts to repeal the British Empire's attempt to sell opium to his people. Part 2 describes 1884, just after the Berlin Conference and the British Empire's movements on the continent. And we pick up the story in 1896, the year of the punitive expedition. 1896. This was the year the British Empire snuck 300 men upriver into the forest towards Benin City. After the snatching into slavery of millions of men and women, so decimated the beautiful city, reducing its pre-colonial majesty to a clutch of tattered husks, the king, the Oba of Benin, banned trade with whichever white men came looking, letting local chiefs know the vehemence of their unwelcome. They came regardless, soldiers disguised as merchants, again cloaked in darkness, the forest gloom thick on their necks, the hunger for black flesh, for black wealth like a self-imposed curse around them. The king, preferring the mental health of his people over the wealth of the world, attacked, the spears and shields of his men rattling the soil, leaves, and canopies of the forest, mowing the British down among the mounds of hot mud and foliage, such that only 2 survived to tell the tale. Whether or not the king's men danced in their blood is unconfirmed, but what I know is the story that was told so roused the vengeance in the heart of empire, they would return to the forest, hands loaded with flames. Part 4, 1897. This was the year the empire struck. There were boys play fighting in the soft grass, girls with half-braided hair snoozing beside their mothers, There were infants trying to catch flies idling by in the heavy heat, fathers working the wide fields, young men distracted among them, watching young women drawing water from wells, all immersed in the glowing minutiae of their lives, all ripe with laughter, their lips plump with love. All must have turned towards the trumpet's sound. All must have gathered, excited at the spectacle of marching soldiers, spectacular in their red coats, curious to the kids who didn't know their strange oaths, didn't know their intentions. The toddlers count their silver buttons gleaming like flat stars. Who stopped smiling first when the volley of musket fire rang? Who was sprayed with blood? Who smelt the gunpowder when the others turned, scattering into the city, screaming through its streets as the soldiers gave chase? Who was too shocked to move? When the empire came to crush the kingdom, to turn its town and villages to ash, to hang the king wherever he was captured, when they touched their hands at the walls of the city, wrapping its clay in flames, who stood by? Who could watch the world burn? Part 5, 1898. This was the year the Tusk entered the empire. When the soldier who smuggled it across the ocean, strapped to the ship's creaking hull, tells how it came into his possession, his tongue will swell with heroism, his throat thick with valor. He won't mention his spine shuddering as Benin City burned, that he watched infants suffocate, the whole families died clinging to each other, clawing the smoke for air, that flames he had lit licked the city, turning the night to day, that when the looting began, he crashed into the king's palace and stood stupefied at its majesty, that in the throne room he felt spirits of past kings weighing heavy on him, that they sized up his soul and found its honor lacking, that this shamed him, that he shamed himself, that the elephant tusk gleamed as if conscious of its royalty, that his hand shook as it reached to touch the figurines and inscriptions carved in its curve, that he sensed a century of history beneath his fingers, that he knew he was unworthy to touch, so torched the palace as he left, dragging his plunder. They could not bear its weight to the ship, or from the ship to the shore, or from the shore to his home, so dragged it again through the streets of Salford and Manchester with fragments of ivory breaking against the cobblestones, splintering into snow. Part 6, 1903. This was the year the elephants struck the empire. Because they do not forget, because they are the whales of their world, custodians of its land, forefathers of forefathers who sat with kings, who were ancient history like living skin from the world beyond, they watched the news, wild as the fire that ate Benin City, spread. Her tongues wagging salacious with stolen riches, so that those who had plundered their kingdom, who turned its palace to ash, carried 3,000 other items across the ocean to hawk to the highest bidders. These thieves greased their hands with sacramental benches, ceremonial masks, stone necklaces, bronze plaques, ivory pendants, envious of what art the tusk could hold. These parts of their bodies, indeed their very bones, to trade, to display in Monday meeting rooms, to bury in cellars, to hide in sheds, to leave in toy chests, to poke and prod like curiosities, evidence of a land of cannibals, a world of the weird. They were dissected, mishandled, misrepresented, mislabeled, misused, misremembered, and forgotten. The elephants came like frost settling on cities, their fragments of bone like talismans, drawing them from the world of spirits, asking they march again. They came like fog in the night, like clouds of conscience, like continents of questions, and swarmed into the spaces where men bury answers and began to push them out. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Inua, for that wonderful and powerful performance, and on behalf of the museum too, for responding to this. part of our collection. I could talk to you all day, but I realise you have to go and we are out of time with the session. So I'll hand back to Dia. Hi, Dia.
Hi, hi Campbell, hi Inua. That was incredibly powerful. Like you say, Campbell, we could talk to Inua forever, but his work is incredibly fascinating, but the work speaks for itself. So I will let the notes of that poem linger in our audience's mind as we close this session, which I found, and I hope you all have as well, to be incredibly rich, incredibly fruitful. And I hope you have a lot to think about and reflect on over the break. Practical points again, the break lasts for a couple of hours. We'll reconvene here at 3 p.m. UK time. Please use this time to talk about the workshop on social media, tweet about it, and all the rest of it. And we'll see you all in 2 hours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Just begin. Welcome back, everyone, and welcome to those who are just joining for the first time, particularly for anyone who's coming from time zones outside of British summertime. I know this is somewhat of an inconvenient time, so please welcome. A reminder that this is being live streamed, and it's also going to be archived and available to be watched later. And I can just ask everyone to mute their microphones as we go forward until you're speaking. So this is now part 2 of our first workshop for the Devolving Restitution African Collections in UK Museums Beyond London project, funded by Open Society Foundations, Oxford University and Art Fund. This session mirrors the morning session in its structure, so it will run for 2 hours, and we ask everyone to stay through the entire session. It's going to be quite dynamic. So it's a really simple format. We're going to begin with a presentation by Megan O'Brien Backhouse of the Pitt Rivers Museum, and she'll be speaking on the Benin objects within the Pitt Rivers Museum inventory. Then we're going to play a pre-recorded interview that my colleague Dia Gupta conducted with Dr. Monica Hanna from the Arab Academy of Science, Technology, and Maritime Transport in Cairo. And Dr. Hanna joins us for our live panel discussion. And on that panel will be journalist Nadine Batchelor-Hunt. We have Shaista Aziz and Deborah McLeaven coming back with us. They represent Oxford Antiracist City. And then we have 2 curators with us on that panel. We have Neil Curtis from the Aberdeen Museum and Gina Boromey from the Rhode Island School of Design. And then after our panel, we're going to return to Dan Hicks and Onikachi Wambu, who are going to give us a final wrap up. And then we're going to conclude today's session with our poetic chronicler, Momtaza Mari, who's been sitting in with us this entire workshop.
Thanks so much for that, Jeremiah, and a very warm welcome to everyone again. As Jeremiah said, this is panel 2, and this panel is going to last for a couple of hours, and we hope it will be dynamic, lively, and get you thinking. So we'd now like to invite Megan O'Brien Backhouse from the Pitt Rivers Museum, who's going to speak to us on a really important piece of work, the catalogue of Benin objects in the Pitt Rivers Museum. So welcome, Megan. If I could ask you to unmute yourself and to put your camera on. It's over to you.
Thank you, Dia, and thank you, Jeremiah. And also thank you to all the participants from this morning's panel and presentations. It was a really thought-provoking workshop this morning. I'm still thinking about it. As Dia and Jeremiah said, my name is Megan O'Brien Backhouse. I have worked at the Pitt Rivers Museum in this instance for 5 years, although I have worked at the Pitt Rivers in the previously, and I did my postgraduate studies here as well. The majority of my career has been in collections work and collections management type work. Currently, I'm working in the research section with Dan on the African restitution projects and supporting Marianne Middlecott, who you heard this morning, particularly on the Restitution of Knowledge project. The first session introduced us to lots of really interesting concepts and talked about the types of events that led to the collections we're discussing today, and talked a great deal about the different types of restitution that we should be aiming to provide, to facilitate. We heard a little bit about objects, but we will be spending more time this afternoon talking about objects. And I will be discussing or presenting one strand of work which feeds into so many other strands of work which we hope will facilitate restitution in all the guises that were mentioned this morning. So I am going to be presenting, as mentioned, the list of objects in the Pitt Rivers Museum, University of Oxford, which have been positively linked to the sacking of Benin City in 1897. Our jobs as curators, as museum professionals, as researchers, is to do the work to understand and research the collections in our institutions, and to make that information as transparent and as accessible as possible, and to open up all the pathways to restitution. So we know that more than 10,000 objects were taken after the sacking of Benin City in 1897. And the list I'm about to present comprises approximately 145 objects, in addition to photographs and manuscripts collections. They have all been researched and definitely linked to the events of that time and to Benin City. I hesitate to call it a definitive list because, as Allegra clearly illustrated this morning, documentation in historic collections, and particularly documentation relating to these events, isn't always as explicit as we'd like it to be, and often incorrect. So there is every possibility that there are more objects in the care of the museum, or I should correct myself after this Suraj's talk this morning, in the museum's collections that may have originated from the sacking of Benin City. But we will wait until objects are retrieved, till documentation is investigated by people with specialist knowledge of all sorts, to let us know if that's the case. Also, just to cover really quickly a couple of legalities, this list will cover 145 objects. Over 100 of those are in the possession, or the university's, the university has legal title to. Over 40 of them are on long-term loan from the Duma Egerton Trust. The slideshow I'm about to go through pretty quickly is, sorry, one moment. Sorry. The slideshow I'm about to go through includes the majority of the 145 objects on the list. Oh, sorry, I'm having some problems with my PowerPoint right now. Let me begin again. The slideshow I'm about to go through fairly quickly includes the majority of the 145 objects on the list, although some will be missing because they do not have images available. The majority of the objects I'm showing, over 100 actually, of the 145 are already on display in the museum. However, many of the objects on display are not clearly visible, and especially due to the dense display types in the museum. Also, another quick note before I get to the slides, in our effort to be transparent, the images you will see represent a range of photographic quality. They are drawn from decades of changing professional photography and internal reference photos. Of the objects that are not included in this slideshow, only 1 or 2 have no images whatsoever. The rest all have images, they just aren't digitally available at this time. And I want to emphasize as well, the document from which this list is drawn will become available on the Pitt Rivers Collections website in the next couple of weeks. It'll be free for all to access and all to download. So without further ado, let me try screen sharing again. There we go. So The objects on this list represent the sheer breadth of material that was taken by the men on the expedition, and they took just about everything. It also demonstrates the voracious appetite of museums and private collectors who wanted to include this art and heritage in their own collections. As we're going through these slides, you'll see on the left the Pitt Rivers Museum accession number. You'll also see a very brief description of what the object is. And then you'll see what provenance information we have. This is provenance information that's in our documentation. The document, the list that will be on the website, will include further provenance information as well as other citations. So you can see, just going through this, that the types of collections range in quality and type. The collection the objects we're looking at right now, you'll see, are bequeathed by Mary Henrietta Kingsley, who some of you may be aware of because she was quite a famous sort of explorer of the late 19th century as a single woman, unmarried, exploring the world on her own. But it is a sizable collection. It comprises approximately 20% of the Benin city material in the museum and on display. And you can see again, this object in particular, no one at the Pitt Rivers and nobody who looked at the object knew what it was. It again just goes to demonstrate people pick things up, and it didn't matter what it was, museums wanted it. This is a particularly interesting piece as it's an ivory door bolt. Again, it's a demonstration of what occurred during the destruction of Benin City when they took everything, including the locks off the doors. I can't speak to all the objects, obviously, otherwise we won't be able to get through all of them in the time allotted. But it's just an opportunity to see what there is, including, as I said, everything, small pellet bells, which museums bought just on their own accord, and pieces of weapons, not even complete weapons. This is an interesting piece, and the story that's in our accession book suggests that this was actually a plaque that had been saved from the British soldiers, from the soldiers on the expedition, hidden. And then a woman, a tradeswoman, we're told, who was in Lagos, sold it to the man who then sold it on to the Pitt Rivers Museum. It just, the sheer number of objects is impressive. This is a rapier, a Portuguese rapier from the 16th or 17th century. We don't know much more about it. Could have been used in the fighting, or it could have just been taken from the palace. This is an interesting piece, as are some of the ones that are following. This was bought by Augustus Henry Lane Fox Pitt Rivers, who was the man who gave the collection that founded the Pitt Rivers Museum here at the University of Oxford. Not long after he gave the collection to the university, he sort of dropped all affiliation with the university and went on to create a new collection and a new museum at his house in Dorset at Farnham. This is one of those pieces, and in fact, he collected a huge number of objects from the punitive expedition and put them in his museum. In 1965, the family decided to close the museum, and they sold off huge numbers of the collections, this being one of them. You'll see it was purchased by William Butler Fagg, who was actually a curator at the British Museum, but his brother Bernard Fagg was the curator and director of the Pitt Rivers Museum. So there are many connections like that. This is a piece where It's from a necklace that was sold to the Pitt Rivers from the Ipswich Museum when the Ipswich Museum decided to get rid of many of its world collections. And what's interesting in our documentation is last year, and one of the documentation says that the necklace was unstrung at the curator's request. Now it's not clear whose curator decided to unstring it, but it was unstrung, and all that we have in terms of photographic evidence of it is this one bead rather than any of the other coral beads or other white beads. You can see this is an interesting head. It's all wood rather than cast or ivory. More pieces from the Pitt Rivers collection. Now we come to the Dumas Egerton pieces. Admiral Sir George Leclerc Egerton was the quartermaster on the punitive expedition. So you will find that the pieces that come next vary from the pieces that we have just seen. They are more significant. There's a larger concentration. He amassed many more than other collectors did, and the quality is much higher. This particular piece is interesting because you can see the scorch marks on it. Were you to see it in person and on display, as it is here at the Pitt Rivers, or the other side of it, you would see much more burning, very clear evidence of the destruction that occurred in Benin City in 1897. This piece is fairly tarnished, so it's hard to tell, but it is in fact silver plated. And there are references to it in a catalog at Map and Webb Jewelers. This is an ivory head rather than a cast one. Again, a complete plaque rather than a broken one. A gilded arm ornament. This is a ceremonial sword, still in its incredibly beautiful coral beadwork sheath. These are jingles that would have come off the clothing of a significant individual. This is an altarpiece from the Queen Mother's own altar, or one of the Queen Mother's own altars. And these are simply beads. Now these next three pieces are interesting. They're watercolors made by Egerton himself in the days immediately after the expedition. This one depicts British soldiers in the King's Palace, and the next two depict Benin not having been destroyed previous to its destruction. So that's it for the objects. Then in addition to the objects, we have collections of photographs and manuscripts. So the diary and photographs of Captain Herbert Walker, photographs taken by Reginald Kerr Granville, donated by Hugh Nevin Nevins, who was a colonial officer, along with the papers of Hugh Nevin Nevins, and then the Egerton papers, which actually are also on long-term loan from the Dumas Egerton Trust. So as I said, all this information will be in a list that will be publicly available on this website in the next couple of weeks. But obviously, this is not where the work ends. As you heard from Manchester earlier, and you'll hear more from our panelists this afternoon, the work continues in many other ways. At the same time, the Pitt Rivers and the university are participants in the Benin Dialogue Group, and we support and are contributing to Digital Benin, but they're all individual steps. They're not finishing lines. They're all very much part of ongoing work in progress. So making the information publicly accessible, facilitating conversations with a variety of community partners, and being active listeners are all parts of this work in progress. If you have any further suggestions or questions or ideas you'd like to share, please do get in touch. But thank you very much. And I very much look forward to the rest of this afternoon's conversation.
Thanks very much for that, Megan. If you could stop your screen sharing, that would be amazing. Thank you. Wonderful. Okay, so I didn't realize, I think, before your presentation, Megan, as to the scale and depth of the looting that really took place and how much has actually ended up at the Pitt Rivers Museum. So thank you very much for that sort of visual encounter with those objects. That was really useful, really insightful. So we're going to move on now to another one of our pre-recorded interviews. This time, we're really delighted to have with us today. She isn't quite here yet, but she's going to be joining us very soon. Dr. Monica Hanna from the Arab Academy for Science, Technology and Maritime Transport in Aswan, Egypt. Monica's research focuses on the space, knowledge and identity of archaeological sites, and she regularly speaks and defends the heritage of Egypt and the urgent need for its protection. And I had the joy recently, it was absolutely joyful, to interview Monica and to listen to her speak about restitution. And it's this pre-recorded interview that we're now going to play. So just bear with me a moment while I set up my screen sharing. Okay, and I will be with you very, very shortly. Okay. So just a moment. Right, so hopefully you can all see my screen, and I'm going to try and turn my video off. Hi, Monica. It's really it's really lovely to have you with us today, and thanks so much for agreeing to talk with us.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you.
Wonderful. Okay, so maybe we can begin a little bit to ease our audience into some of the issues we're discussing today at the workshop. What does the term restitution mean to you?
Restitution means to me returning stolen rights. Whatever these rights are, you restitute them. And I think it comes from the Latin word that's also used in law, which is restitutio in integrum, which is most of the law that we use stems actually from the Roman period. So when we do the restitutio, as the Romans said, is that we return something to before the original offense, so that there is no longer grounds for a legal claim. So restitution comes from this perspective, from the Latin word of restitutio, restituto.
And this is how you view that term.
Exactly.
Okay. And so would you say there is a particular sort of Egyptian take on restitution? What are the Egyptian particularities around the concept of restitution?
The problem is that most of the Western museums think just because they took these objects while we were on the Ottoman occupation, while Egyptians did not have sovereignty over their own country, that it's legal. But the legality is not just about thinking that we have followed the law or the rule or the decree of the Wali of Egypt, which was Muhammad Ali, who was also not Egyptian, he was from Albanian descent. But doing something that is legal entails that it's also correct, fair, and ethical. So this idea, our collection is legal, it actually a faux pas. It's a pitfall. It's trying to say, oh no, we did it correctly, we're fine, we took these objects under partage. But then again, if you look at the collection in the Louvre, Marianne, who was also the director of the Egyptian Antiquities Service, was also the person doing the partage. So he was also dividing between the Antiquities Service that he was the head for and the Louvre Museum for which he worked. So insane conflict of interest. So come and speak about legality under this position, and it's utter corruption. So, exactly. Then you get these museums, oh no, we're legal. This is not true. It's the elephant in the room that they're refusing to see.
So you're saying that there is a difference here between the technical law and the ethical situation around
yes,
restitution.
definitely. And even the implementation of the law itself. Because something is illegal depends not just on doing it according to the law, but also the situation of the implementation of the law.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's a brilliant answer. Thank you. So what would you say, to people perhaps in the West who might think that Egypt already has a lot of its own objects? Why would they want anything back?
Well, Zia, if you have 3 kids and one kidnapped one of those children,
yes,
what would you do to get this child back? Would someone tell you, and this person does not have any children. So he would come and tell you, but you have already 2 other children. Why do you want a 3rd child? How would you respond to that?
I would have very strong feelings about that.
Exactly. I mean, compare it not just to children, but to houses or cars, or anything that belongs to you.
Sure.
Exactly the same.
Sure.
Because they always come in the response that it's a universalist heritage, that this heritage belongs to the whole world, does not only belong to Egypt. But how about the Western collections also sharing part of these collections with the so-called source countries in Africa? Why can't Cairo get the Mona Lisa?
Indeed.
Why? Exactly. Why? I mean, the emblems of European and Renaissance art does not exist in our countries as well. So this universalism of heritage was done to convince countries like us that Western countries can keep the objects that they keep.
Absolutely. And would you sort of say it's also an issue of access? So if you have, a lot of Egyptian objects currently in Western museums, do people in Egypt get to access them?
Exactly. I mean, they come and say, well, Universalist Museum provide access to the heritage. But that's not true, because if you think of the current travel inequalities, the collection would be more accessible to a larger number of people in Egypt, because Egypt does not have visa travel restrictions, rather than the UK. I mean, I know colleagues who are academics in academia who have their visas continuously refused. So how about them trying to do a research at the British Museum or at the Pitt Rivers or any other museum?
Absolutely. So it's fraught. The whole idea of people from Egypt coming over here, either to look at the objects or to research the objects, is very fraught.
Definitely.
And so sort of, I'm interested in this idea. We are talking a bit about, the movement of objects, or if you like, the non-movement of objects. Does that also link with the sort of movement of people or the non-movement of people?
Yes. I mean, I find it very interesting to look at how there are very strict refugee policies for Europe for allowing people to go in, but there are impossible exit visas for the objects, as if it's again trying to separate the people from their heritage. The objects have become much more precious than the people's lives and livelihoods. And there is this distinction, I mean, that no, we cannot do, we will not separate the collections. And this idea, I mean, if you come and think about refugees from Syria who are entering European countries in the past few years, and Europe wanting to repatriate the people back to Syria, but refusing to repatriate the cultural heritage associated with these people. So the same with Iraqis in France, and the same with Egyptians. It's just everywhere.
Absolutely. So tell us a little bit about, some of the objects you've really loved to work with.
These days I'm working on the bust of Nefertiti. I'm looking into the ethical implications of Burkhardt taking her out. I'm studying many archival documents that so far has actually proved how this Burkhardt was actually a swindler, how he tricked the Egyptian authorities, who were not actually Egyptian, because the director of the Antiquity Service was French. And how he tricked the Frenchman who was responsible for the Egyptian antiquities, and he took away the Nefertiti bust. And then this whole idea that I read about how Nefertiti is the ambassador of Egypt in Berlin. And I find this the most ridiculous idea because, again, diplomatic exchange entails that you send an ambassador and you receive an ambassador. It's never a one-way thing. So what do we have in Cairo that relates to the German monarchy? Nothing. Or the German heritage? Nothing. Unless you would call selling pretzels.
I think that's a bit of a stretch. And talking about Nefertiti, I can see that wonderful bust right behind you wearing a mask. So she is a COVID-conscious Nefertiti that you've got there.
Definitely.
So that's a very lovely addition, I think, a lovely visual addition to this interview. Okay, so maybe my final question, Monica, would be, if you were asked, what would be your advice to museums in the West now about their colonial collections?
I think repatriating the most important objects that are important for the identity and the past cultures of African and Middle Eastern populations is very important, because such impoverishment that happens to the cultural heritage by keeping it in Western museums will help continue this very serious gap between the East and the West. So this is number one. Number two, the curators of the museums should also question their own conscience. Do they want to keep stolen objects in the museums? And then again, museums now are in a crisis. They need to find a new role in the 21st century that deals with this colonialism. I don't think it will no longer be acceptable that we continue what started imperialism, that it continue. This cultural imperialism needs to stop. Number three is that restitution should not just be to restitute the objects. Restitution should also be for the agency and the knowledge production around the history and the heritage that's concerned with these objects. And I think that with modern museology now, people are actually evolving, that the story you tell in the museum is a story that you send a message with, or you make a point with, to educate, to set a political statement, or what have you. Objects, keeping original objects, keeping objects in 3D scan, or is now making things a lot easier. So these museum curators need to get out of their colonialist box where, it feels like Uncle Scrooge wanting to keep everything for himself. Yeah. So Uncle Scrooge needs to democratize his collection.
I think that's a great message.
Yeah, exactly. Uncle Scrooge needs to democratize his collection, or else he will also become obsolete in his own context. Museums, imperialist museums and colonialist museums are going to become obsolete in their own countries. And their only way to keep up and to stop becoming obsolete is by actually tackling such colonialist legacies and by rethinking and re-theorizing the role of museums in the 21st century.
So, I think I know the answer to this. So just rewriting some labels around a particular object, say from Egypt, is not enough.
No, of course not. Of course not. Of course not. And not just from Egypt, provenance from Egypt, but also we need to know, how did it come there?
Exactly.
Was it looted? Was it stolen? Was it bought from a shady antiquities dealer? Was it taken to the Western Museum because this country was under colonialism and the native people could not say no? We need to know the full story. We need to get all the facts straight. And I think that this should also start with the Rosetta Stone at the British Museum. That is actually a spoil of war put in London.
Fantastic. So I'm going to ask you a question because it's my personal interest. I'm interested in language. And sometimes, as just very rightly as you're talking about, the language of the labels around some of these objects that are currently on display are very misleading because they adopt a certain objectifying tone that actually, I think, disguises a lot of the violence around which particular objects were taken.
Definitely.
So you think definitely we should be, that
Yes.
should be addressed?
That this should be immediately.
So you think that's a starting point?
That's a starting point, and I think there should also be a discourse between the different communities, the communities who stole and the communities who want to repatriate, rather than just museum officials and actors. I think the discourse needs to go to a wider audience.
Thank you. That's been a really, really productive and wonderful interview, Monica. Thank you so much for speaking to us.
Thank you, dear.
Okay, brilliant.
Great. Dia, that was so powerful. And Monica, thank you so much. What a great exchange you guys had. And in a lot of ways that mirrors the interview with Suraj Razul this morning on kind of these gatekeeping effects of restitution and everything that was spoken about during the first panel this morning and early afternoon. And so we're now pleased to actually move on to our next panel discussion. And as before, we're going to kind of do this set circular flow of responses with our panelists. And so we're joined this afternoon by Gina Borromeo, who's the Chief Curator and Curator of Ancient Art at the Rhode Island School of Design Museum in Providence, Rhode Island, coming to us from the States. And then we have Neil Curtis, Head of the Museums and Special Collections at the University of Aberdeen. And both Gina and Neil have firsthand experiences with return processes actually related to the Benin bronzes. So it fills in nicely with the conversation and with Megan's presentation. And then we're also pleased to have Shaista Aziz coming back with us and Deb McLeaven, and they're both representing Oxford Antiracist City. And so we have them on the panel as well today. If I can ask everyone to start turning on their cameras.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for that, Jeremiah. So in addition to the people Jeremiah mentioned, we have a couple of other speakers as well. So we're going to be welcoming Dr. Monica Hanna, whose interview we just heard. And can I just say, maybe to you, Jeremiah, my favorite bit from that interview is when Monica says that Western museums are like Uncle Scrooge. I think that is really something that stayed with me from that interview. I love that analogy. Going back to our speakers, we're very pleased to have with us as well Nadine Batchelor Hunt. Welcome, Nadine. Do turn your camera on and unmute yourself. Nadine is a journalist and a broadcaster. She has really sort of interesting encounter with the Benin bronzes. So she campaigned to return a Benin bronze from Jesus College, Cambridge, which was in the form of a cockerel during her time there as an undergraduate.
Excellent. And so we're going to go in the set order of Gina, then Neil, Shaista, Deb, Nadine, and then Monica. And then we'll try to circle back around again in that same order, going back to Gina to do it again. So Gina, if I can turn the floor over to you at this point.
Okay, thank you so much. It is a pleasure for me to be here with all of you. I really learned so much from this morning's discussion, and it was absolutely worth getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning for it. But also before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the wonderful dialogues I have had with other museum curators, not just here in the United States, but with very generous curators I have met who are all part of the Benin Dialogue Group. And I know that our work here at RISD would not have been possible without these conversations. And so with that, let me try to just share my screen so you will see the object that I am talking about. And let's see, here we go. So do you all see that? Thank you. Okay, so this is a head of a Noba that has been in the RISD Museum collection since 1939, and I have been doing provenance research on this particular piece. It was given to us by Miss Lucy Truman Aldrich, and she acquired it at a sale, a Knoedler Gallery sale in New York City in 1935. But beyond that, it has been very difficult to ascertain the ownership of this piece. It is currently on view and has been on view in various galleries at the museum, because we don't really have a gallery of African art in the museum. This is the one significant object of African art in the collection. So it has been shown in various contexts, in a chronological display where it was shown with other European objects. It has also been shown in the galleries of ancient art, which I curated. And it has been discussed in terms of the materials and techniques that were used to make it. And most recently, it has been shown in a gallery that discusses imperialism and colonialism. So as I said, it has been difficult for us to ascertain its history, but we do know that it stopped for a while in France before it traveled to the United States. And we know this from the custom stamp and the, the stickers that you can read here that say imported from France. And so prior to its going to New York, it had been in France. It is, I am showing you here the label that is shown with the object, where we clearly state that it was deaccessioned in the fall of 2020 in preparation for its return to Nigeria. And you see that we have bolded the fact that we recognize the looted status of this sculpture and that we are anticipating its repatriation. That process was a very long one. We began really working with this object, as I said, in conjunction with classes at RISD, at the Rhode Island School of Design, and with Brown University. And we have shown it along with I think we have written these labels in collaboration with the professors who have wanted to show it. And there has been all along during the course of our research, a shift, a gradual evolution of the label that we have shown with it. So for instance, at the very beginning, we talked about the 1897 campaign in Benin City as the Benin Punitive Expedition. And most recently, we have just shied away from that language and just right out called it the Benin Massacre, because that is what it was. And this came about from discussions with students at RISD and at Brown. We also, people know there was a protest at the RISD Museum in 2018, and this was really brought about by not just, I believe, President Macron's statement that France was going to repatriate objects taken during the colonial period, but as well announcements by the Benin Dialogue Group that objects would be returned to Benin on a loan basis. And in addition to that, let me see. Also, I think the commissioning of the Sar-Savoir report. And so at RISD, we confronted this protest, and we realized that one of the things we had to do was to make our work transparent, because unbeknownst to the protesters, we had been in conversation with curators, as I said, in the Benin Dialogue Group and also here in the United States, to see whether there was a US effort to join together to return objects. It is, I have to say here as well that returning this object is very much something that the staff at the RISD Museum is very much committed to. And we have, since 2017, basically discussions in which we all get together in conversations called All-Staff Dialogues, where we try to confront issues of power and racism, colonialism, and social equity in museums and beyond. And we feel that, we feel strongly that these conversations had to emanate within the staff itself and be conducted within the staff and not be facilitated at all by outside facilitators, so that we ourselves at the museum begin to build a capacity for discussing difficult issues. And so basically we, in 2020, as I said, we deaccessioned this object, and we had been speaking to our board about it for quite a long time. And we had brought them on board by inviting them to talks such as the one given by Peju Laiwola here at RISD in March of 2019, as long and other events. So anyway, what I want to say is that I believe that this deaccession is just the first step in developing relationships with colleagues in Nigeria and elsewhere, and that I believe that this restitution of this object should be decided not by members of the RISD Museum, but by the folks in Nigeria who own it, and we are just the custodians of it until that time happens. And that restitution also comes along with a larger concept of reparation. And so we want to build these relationships. We want to perhaps think about bronze artists coming to the Rhode Island School of Design and coming here for an internship or a scholarship in which they could exchange ideas and practices with the budding artists that we have in our institution. So anyway, it is a larger issue. It goes beyond the museum itself and reaches out into not just the institution that we are a part of, but to the larger community to which we have made presentations on this object. So I will leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you, Gina, is really wonderful. And I think that leads on nicely to you, so if we can turn you to lead the floor.
Thank you. So I'll just give a couple of words at the start about the University of Aberdeen's decision to return. In some ways, I don't think it's a terribly interesting story, so I'll keep it quite short. And I want to emphasize that it's not about a race to be first. There's a whole load of museums and institutions that are all having the same sorts of discussions in maybe slightly different ways, and different ones will pop up at different stages. But I think this is a widespread discussion. It's something I definitely don't want to overclaim. But I think the basis of the discussions we had in Aberdeen were very straightforward. It's about stolen property. And so although I think the university has legal title from its purchase in 1957, the point at issue was the lack of moral title deriving from 1897. So the legal title enabled us to act on the moral title. If we hadn't been the legal owners, we couldn't make a decision. So it was an enabling thing. But I think it's that moral title and the way it's theft with murder. So that wasn't really very difficult. I think the most time-consuming bit, as Gina's been saying, is actually all the discussions that we've been having with people in Benin City and Nigeria. Unlike previous cases I've been involved in where we've had a claim, this is one where we went out first. And so finding who to talk to, making sure you're talking to the right people, that takes time, that's careful, and that's not finished. So, I think this main point I want to make is to focus on what is going on in Benin City and Africa and elsewhere. It's not about us. But some wee points about the process we went through. We've been involved with repatriation, as have many other museums. We've had, I think, it's about 5 cases over 20 years, which I think on the one hand actually shows how few items. It also shows how difficult it is for, a claimant and a museum to handle. It's not easy, and it deserves not to be easy, because if this matters to people, they deserve the respect of time and commitment and effort. So this is, you know, it's a really important thing, but it's not maybe numerically as important. Not sure what I mean. And I mentioned the word claimant, and I'm rather taken Nick Thomas is now talking about the word proposal, and I'm interested in that. I think there's things about the language we need to be very careful about. One of the things that I think made it easier for us is the university had just gone through a strategic planning exercise, and we now have a strategic plan for the next 20 years. And this identified 4 things the university wanted to be, which were inclusive, interdisciplinary, sustainable, and international. And we have a slogan, which is a sort of rewriting of the 1494 letter from the bishop to the Pope, open to all and dedicated to the pursuit of truth in the service of others. So running what we were talking about against that strategic plan, it was very simple. And so it went, there was a discussion in the panel, and unusually our panel includes a representative of the, for these purposes, claimant. So it's a discussion, it's not a hearing. That then writes a report, which then goes on to the senior management team, which unanimously supported it and passed it on to the governing body, University Court, which unanimously supported it. And, you know, basically that's where we are. So now the steps all belong in Benin City. And we've had an amazing amount of publicity out of it. And I'm actually very pleased in the way that the publicity was fairly flat. We told the story. We used, I think, pretty clear words, and most of the social media response repeated what we were saying. It didn't go off into culture wars. It didn't become contentious. And I think a lot of that was because we focused on the truth. It wasn't really contentious. So just going a wee bit further than that is thinking about, you know, what museums are. And I've, you know, to me, museums are about relationships with people. And the objects in the collections are physical manifestations of those relationships, good, bad, horrible, whatever. There's, I mean, that sense of the seething massive relationships in the collection. And I think one of the really important steps when working with a collection is trying not to call it our collection. You can step aside from that. You have a responsibility to those relationships and those people who've been involved, but it's not your collection. And I think that once you make that step, it's hugely liberating, because then the people that you're working with matter more than the objects. So you then are thinking about what is the best future, and it's about ethics. So it's not actually about what is right or wrong, because there could be many different rights. I mean, I remember the first repatriation involved in was a sacred bundle that went to the Kainai Nation in Western Canada. And they commented that the university had looked after it well for 70 years, but not properly in a spiritual way. And the person who ended up having that back and dancing it ordered up a kilt jacket to wear when he danced it, because he wanted to remember the time it had spent in Scotland. So we're not denying that part of its heritage. What we're saying is, what's the best that we can come up with now in discussion? It'll never be absolutely right, but you know, it's contingent, and times change. I mean, the weird thing about museums is they think they're permanent. You know, it's been a fairly short period of humanity that's seen museums, and how much longer is that going to continue? Don't know. But to think about colonialism, I think one of the big things is the way that colonialism is a way in which the values and interests of the dominant group become seen to be natural. And it's about challenging that. And you know, so therefore things like colonialism, missionary activity, the idea of a universal museum, all those have been portrayed as if they're rational. And that's the dangerous bit. But I'm also going to pick at the title of this seminar, this Devolving Restitution, which I really dislike. And it's probably because in Scotland, and the idea of devolution, because power devolved is power retained. It's a very British thing to do. And it assumes that there is a viewpoint, and I can say this safely in Aberdeen, that it appears that the world of Oxford, Cambridge, London is normal and natural and understands the world. It doesn't. There are lots of different ways of understanding the world. And I think that wee bit of distance I've got, just tiny wee bit, a wee bit to the west, you see it slightly differently. So I don't want to have power devolved to museums to help repatriate, restitute, return. I'm not too fussed about the words. I want us just to do it. And I think that's important. And if through what we do, those in the centers of power start thinking differently, that would be really good. But let's flip it that way around. But I also am a wee bit concerned about even the terms of decolonization and human rights. Those are other universal words that come from a particular viewpoint. I may find, genital mutilation utterly abhorrent, but is it wrong because it's against universal rights, or is it wrong because people who experience it think it is wrong? And we've got to be really careful that we don't impose what we think is right on the rest of the world. And that's where there's a real danger of neocolonialism coming out of this move towards restitution. I mean, that was raised this morning, and that really worries me, because I think it affects how we do it, how we talk to people. Do we start, I mean, I know there are a number of museums contact us saying, how do we give these things back now? I said, hold on. Why are you doing this? Are you doing it to make yourself feel good? Are you doing it because people actually want it? And so fundamentally, the thing is all about shifting power and shifting the power away from the people who've got the power already and the voice to the people who don't have the voice and listening to them. So it's going to be really difficult, and it's really easy to make grand statements and feel good about it, but it's the doing of it that matters. And I think what we've done is tiny. And, we have a collection of 300,000 items, and say we have a collection. I just said it, didn't I? I am responsible for whatever, but that's a lot. And some of those stories are nice ones. And slightly different story here. I've been, in museums around the world, and I'm from Glasgow originally, and seen a chair by the Glasgow architect, Charles Mackintosh. And I was delighted to see one in Paris and delighted to see one in New York. It was good seeing them elsewhere, but that's because most of them are in Glasgow. So if you really want to understand, you go to Glasgow. Everywhere else can have a viewpoint on things, and that's good. But it's trying to shift the power away from the dominant center just now. And I'm afraid that dominant center includes all of us on this call today. Thank you.
Excellent. Really, thank you so much, Neil. And Shaista, we'd love to hear from you now.
Yeah, thank you for that, Neil. I'm not part of the dominant centre, and I'm very happy to say that, and that's just a fact. So you asked about museums and what are they? Museums are violent places. They can be very sad places, and they can be disorientating places. They can also be places where people continue to be gaslighted because of the way the museum is constructed and the presentation of things in there. I was in the Pitt Rivers Museum again last week. One of your colleagues asked me to come in. We had a discussion about decolonising and history. And as I was walking around, I mean, it's not the first time I've been in the Pitt Rivers. Obviously, I'm from the city. I've been there a lot as a child and as an adult. But all of a sudden, I started coughing. I'm in recovery from long COVID, so coughing perhaps isn't abnormal, should we say? But I started coughing, and I understood immediately that I was having a very strong, visceral, emotional reaction to what was in on that floor in that space, and I then articulated it to the colleague, and she immediately said, if you would like to stop, if you would like to leave, please let me know. We can go outside and get some fresh air. I know that I was having that reaction because I've taken a lot of time out to understand my reaction to colonialism, racism and violence, be it in the so-called past or be it ongoing. And so I was able to articulate that, but there's a lot of people who aren't able to articulate that. And then when it comes to the, what do we need to do? I think this issue of returning things, as has already been said, is not just that's an easy response. It's really easy to just say, okay, we're going to return things. The difficult work is actually related to unpicking what were we doing with it in the first place? Why was it here? And what was it, what did we do with it when it was here? So I think that's the more difficult work, and then working out how to return it, but return it and then what happens next. So for me, this is not just a question of just literally transporting things, and I'm using the word things loosely. It needs the work that needs to be done needs to be much deeper than that. And then if we bring it back to the city of Oxford, yeah, again, you know, what is the connection with the museum and the diaspora communities and the second and third generation members of those communities as well? We're Oxonians, born and raised here, but my parents, for example, are from the Indian subcontinent, that were from what then became Pakistan. So that, you know, there's plenty of things in the Pitt Rivers Museum from parts of Pakistan and parts of the continent, but what is the relationship with the museum and the wider communities in Oxford and then beyond as well? So that needs to be examined, that needs to be discussed as well. I also think that final thing I'll end up on is there is a raging culture war going on in this country, as we know, and this work is not easy work, and neither should it be, but it's only going to get more and more difficult, and it's only going to get more and more challenging, and, you know, people are going to come under verbal attack, as we know, hopefully not physical attack, but we just don't know. But also within that, there will be people who are working on these issues who are going to be more visible, hyper visible, because of their race, because of their ethnicity, because of their gender, because of the way they identify, and that will also be dragged into this story, which we're already seeing. And I think we need to be really aware of that, and we need to work out what we're going to do to protect people with their agency fully in place. So I'm excited about this work, but like I said, I think there's a lot of things that need to be really thought through, and the thinking has to be, many other people need to be allowed, and I'll use the word allowed because you're only invited into these spaces. So you're given, you know, not everyone is invited into these spaces. So we need to work out what we're going to do about that as well. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Shaista. And Deb, can we hear from you now?
Yes, thank you. Well, I'm learning all the time, and as you know, with every speaker, I'm picking up more ideas and learning more. I think I'm just going to say a little bit more about, obviously, some of the topics or issues that we mentioned or talked about this morning. And as the conversation is developing, one of the things I've learned is this word or this expression, because remember, I'm here as a town. I'm here as part of the town. I'm not involved in academic research about the artifacts or anything. So even though I know the Pitt Rivers is full of lots of stolen goods and stuff, I haven't heard this word punitive expeditions. And I'm welcome that it's now been called by colleagues a massacre. However, I think this once again highlights that and it's also very interesting, it highlights the language, and who are we talking about, and who are the audiences that really museums want to show. Well, do the museums want to show their artifacts to anyone other than academics or the people who are doing the collecting, which is sort of part of what we're talking about. So I think the whole thing about whose history are we looking at when we look at these artifacts, this to me highlights it even more. And as I said, I'm repeating now the point about, I think we need to make the social historical connections with the artifacts for everybody, not just the academics and the collectors, which is also what part of this, part of this conversation that we're having. And we do have to devolve power, whether that's the correct name for the workshop, I don't know, but it is about changing things and changing those power relations. I think the other key thing that I want to point out at this stage is that, yes, Oxford University does have such massive national and international influence. It is, but not obviously in the interests of us, the people of Oxford from the town. It's obviously massively important and in the interests of maintaining those power relationships. But I think also that's what's potentially more exciting and challenging about this work, because people will take notice of what Oxford University does. And I think also that's why I welcome that the Pitt Rivers are working with Antiracist City, because there are communities, and we work with people who are affected by these objects, whose history is connected to them. But as we already know, our history is hidden and our voices aren't heard. So I'll leave it there for now. Thanks.
Thanks so much for that, Debs. That's really helpful from you and really useful insights. Thank you very much. So I'd like to invite now Nadine Batchelor-Hunt to please unmute herself, turn her camera on. And
hello. So first of all, thank you so much for having me, and all of you guys, like all the panelists, are so amazing. So I kind of feel very honoured to be included on this panel. So basically, my story when it comes to experiences with the Benin bronzes is I started at Jesus College, Cambridge in 2013 as an undergrad. And basically, when I started, the Jesus College crest is 3 cockerels, and in the hall there was a cockerel on a platform, and it had a Latin inscription on it. So I was doing a classics access course for people that were going to Cambridge to study classics from state school backgrounds. So initially, when I started, I couldn't read what the Latin said. So it seemed strange just to have this kind of bronze cockerel in the hall, but I just didn't really think much of it. And then as my Latin came along, I think it was in second year, I started to understand what it said, and it used the verb rapio rapere, which is to seize or to steal, instead of dodare, which is to give. So I'm thinking, right, so it was basically talking about the bronze being seized from Benin. So I spoke to my director of studies at Cambridge. I think he's a professor now, so Professor James Claxon. And he basically said, you should look more into the history of this bronze. It didn't really get here by ethical means. So yeah, I started looking into the history of it, and it's really refreshing to see people refer to it as a massacre, because obviously when I was researching, it was referred to as a punitive exposition in 1897. So yeah, so I started researching the bronze, raising awareness of it, and then I, with a few other Jesus students and Jesuits, started the Benin Bronze Appreciation Committee. And then basically our goals were to get the Benin bronze back to Benin/Nigeria. And that was basically the root of what we did. So yeah, so I was tasked with the research of the bronze, kind of going into the history of it, how it got to Jesus. Basically, it was gifted to the college, I think in the 30s, by somebody who had acquired it. I can't remember his name now. I think it was somebody Neville. Yeah, and that's basically how it ended up there. And it was virtually, and it's kind of depressing that the reason it was there is because our crest was a cockerel and the bronze was a cockerel. It just kind of shows you how shallow and how much of thought had gone into the bronze's presence at the college. Because also Jesus had these this room full of cockerels, like glass cockerels, ceramic cockerels. So it's they kind of collect them. And obviously the actual history of this bronze wasn't on the plaque. It was just said that it was stolen, which was a strange admission. Anyway, so we as a committee worked on repatriation. We built a case for it. We managed to get the support of the president of Nigeria and the royal family of Benin. And then effectively what happened was there was a bit of a divide in the committee at one stage. So basically, when I had started my work on the repatriation of the bronze, it was based on the ethical and moral case of repatriating things that were stolen during colonialism and empire. That was it. There wasn't anything else. That was the core issue of anti-racist message as well. And some people, well, it was a divide, but we worked out in the end, and we moved back to the moral argument. But some people were trying to think, oh, maybe we'll put an incentive in to get the university to send it back. And I think that's one of the things we have to resist with this restitution, because although the students were well-meaning, they were saying things like, the college will reap the financial benefits of returning the bronze, and that kind of language is neo-colonial, as we've spoken about on this panel, and also just takes away from the ethical and moral case of repatriating the bronze. So there's a disagreement there, but it was resolved. But so we basically decided to bring the case we built to repatriate the bronze before the student union first, to vote it through, so it had the support of the student union. But in the process of that, the original, so basically, although the divides in the committee were fixed, the original report to repatriate it did have some neo-colonial rhetoric in it, which was later changed, but that was sent to the college because the college have to see it, anything that goes for the JCSU or something like that. I'm not entirely sure of the internal processes. So they basically pulled the bronze from the hall very unceremoniously. Like, we just went in there one day and it was gone. And we found that quite bizarre. You know, like, it was clear there was a desire from the students to have a democratic debate about its future, and it was just removed. Anyway, so the JCSU, our student union, voted to repatriate the bronze with the Benin Bronze Committee. It was slightly expanded. Basically, while there was the kind of divide in the committee, I found a student at Pembroke College, Jason Okundai. His family from the Edo tribe, and he felt, you know, a very personal connection to this bronze, and he joined the committee as well to kind of inform the way in which we were going to approach repatriation. And then yeah, so basically that happened. The college, then we took it to the college, and I think it was before the ethical, we went before the ethical affairs committee and kind of made the case. There was some strange moments in the meeting from senior members of the college, some fellows. Some of them were saying things like, you know, well, how do we know it's going to be safe in Benin/Nigeria? And it was like, well, that's not really your concern. Like, it's not ours. And again, that's quite neo-colonial kind of idea to think, oh, these people can't look after their own culture. So we had to like push back on some of the things there. They were also talking about making a replica to put in the hall, and it's like, I get. It's not like it's going in a museum. It's almost like you're replicating it because you like it, rather than you're appreciating it as a piece of art / you know, heritage. So we also had issue with that. It wasn't, you know, if they were like, we're going to set up an exhibition or we're going to make a copy of the bronze and then present that with its full history, but it was more like, oh, if we're going to send it back, let's just have a copy that we can just put in the hall. It's like that just, again, just felt wrong. Anyway, so after the Ethical Affairs Committee, I think the college spooked and basically passed it on to the universities centrally. And then obviously, I mean, if you people here at Oxford, Cambridge, you know that kind of when that happens, it's into the abyss. Like, you don't really know what's going to happen next. And then, yeah, and then we weren't really in touch really very much with the university. They kind of went dark. I think some people from Benin, I think some ambassadors were visited to talk about the bronze, but the college kind of backed off and said, you know, this is now a university matter. And this was actually before all the culture wars kicked off in full swing. So I imagine it would have been a lot worse. I mean, I don't even want to imagine what it would have been like now for my mental health and like other committee members' mental health. So yes, so then the university took it over, and there was discussions at the university were going to loan the Benin bronze back to Nigeria and all this kind of weird stuff. And again, that was just like not acceptable. You know, you don't loan something that was stolen back to the people you stole it from. Like, it's just, you know, it's dystopian. So then nothing really seemed to happen. And I think the university got spooked again because they obviously, the Fitzwilliam Museum has a lot of stuff that was looted and stolen in it. And I think there was a fear that if you start returning one thing, then it becomes a trend. I personally got frustrated with Jesus because they could have taken a decision as an autonomously as a college to return it at that moment, but they didn't. And then anyway, so I graduated in 2017, and then I kind of kept up to date with it, but again, it just went very quiet. I genuinely don't know where they put the bronze once they removed it from the hall. It could have been at Jesus, it could have gone to the Central University, I just don't know. And then in 2019, Jesus got its first Black Master, also Black Woman Master, and first Black Master of any Oxbridge College, Sunita. And she basically started a commission to look into the colonial history of Jesus College. And because it's not just the bronze that there's an issue with at Jesus. And there was a guy, for example, a guy called Tobias Rustat, who is like honoured every year by the college as a philanthropist, because some students receive a bursary. I think it's because my friend got it, which she's now like giving the money back to in different ways. But when she started, it's for the children of clergy. And she's the daughter of a vicar, and she got this scholarship, and she'd say to me, you know, we have to go to this honouring event every year, and it's really, really bizarre and like really problematic, some of the stuff that they say about what, you know, they kind of, it was very much like celebrating Tobias Rustat rather than an honest account, honest interrogation of history. So when Sunita started, she basically said, we need to investigate this, and part of our investigation is going to be to repatriate the bronze. So it took a while. I mean, we started raising awareness on it, I think in 2015. And it wasn't until 2019 when the master, which was at the time Ian Wright, left, and then Sunita started. But yeah, so then the college have decided to repatriate it. It's not gone back yet, and I think a lot of the organisation to send it back was kind of derailed because of COVID, and obviously you can't travel, and I think there's a desire to do it in person, given the kind of gravity, rather than just sending it over in quite like a very unhuman way, not really having that contact and that exchange. But yeah, so that's really the kind of work that I did on that. And it was kind of broadly a movement at Cambridge more generally to just decolonize the spaces, be it portraits, be it the curriculum, you know, just providing context and explaining what actually happened with these artifacts and these pieces of heritage, because fundamentally, you know, now, it's particularly having like a conference like we're having here, the fact that the only reason Jesus had it there was because it was their college crest just shows the lack of care, the lack of concern that you know, the college had it there for decades and they just did not care. So I think it's just broadly, and I think the old universities, particularly Oxbridge, are particularly guilty of this, because some things are just there for so long that they don't even interrogate it. And you know, as we spoke about earlier in this, like the culture wars, it's frustrating because, you know, people like us are accused of trying to erase history, or accused of trying to, you know, not being proud of Britishness or whatever, when actually the key goal we have is to educate people. Like, that is fundamentally, decolonization isn't about erasing history, it's about having an honest interrogation of history. And I think my heart just go out to students at universities now and fellows at universities now, because the culture wars are far worse when I was an undergrad, just, you know, 3-4 years ago. But yeah, so that's basically me. Hopefully I didn't ramble too much, but that's like my story.
Thanks so much for that, Nadine. And interesting, remember that cockerel at Jesus College, and I had no idea it was a Benin bronze. So this history is absolutely fascinating to me. I would like to call upon now our final panelist. I'm not entirely sure she's here with us, but Monica, if you are, could I call upon you to unmute yourself and to speak to us?
Hi, dear. I'm here, but I'm still out with students, so I'd rather not put the camera.
Okay, fair enough.
I'm wearing my mask. All
You're
right.
wearing a mask. Fair enough. You're like Nefertiti then in our interview. That's fine.
Yes, here. There you go.
Over to you, Monica.
I've been listening to the discussions since this afternoon, and I think they're really very interesting. And what I'm also thinking is how also a different dimension that I have been overlooking for quite some time is also about how this colonialism and stealing of the culture of the other has also been androcentric. So in this perspective, we have, of course, this written history of the white man that has also excluded a lot of the women accounts. So I think that as part of the discourse of decolonization, we need also to rethink about how the decolonization of the museums and of the histories and of the archaeology and of the heritage would also re-put the women, especially after Butler's feminist theory. How can we re-put women and restitute also women in the historical discourse that have been not there because of the white man bias? So I'm very interested in also seeing how this plays also in the displays of museums, how new exhibitions actually incorporate women in the past, and how also the violence that happened to women in the past could be reincorporated in this, because I was just reading the accounts of Gustave Flaubert in Egypt and how he met the courtesan Khosrow-Khenem in Esna. And we only know, again, the history of this profiling of Egyptian Oriental women as these sensual, sexual women. And he, of course, is the white man who could not resist this vile woman. And I think this also comes very well into the historical narrative and its relation to the object. We'll never know the version of the story of Khosrow-Khenem. We'll never realize that. But I think much of the Western powers has been in feminizing the other. So it's usually the white male man who is also feminizing other cultures to prove his superiority over them. So I think this has affected a lot of the mistakes of the past, and taking, of course, the bust of Nefertiti as a brilliant example. And you can see how it was always white men who were being protective of her. Burkhardt, Hitler, hair part singer now. And we need to think differently about how this is also part of the colonialist discourse that we need to remediate. Thank you, Dia.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Monica. I'll hand over to Jeremiah now.
Perfect. Thank you. So we have 12 minutes to do one final quick loop. So I wonder if I can ask all of our speakers to, in a very brief, 1 or 2 minutes, give us maybe a final thought if you want to respond to each other, or just leave us with something. Now's your chance. So Gina, we'll go back to you.
Again, I am just thrilled to have been here to take part in this conversation and to learn from all of you. But I think what the thing that sticks with me here is that how closely tied these objects, these cultural materials are to the people who created them. And I think our focus going forward, it should be to perhaps focus more on that connection to humans rather than our, I don't know, connection to the objects. And I think it's kind of just a refocusing of the curatorial practice, or really on our practice as human beings to focus on our shared humanity, shared cultures, rather than the ownership of these objects.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Gina. And Neil, a final thought from you.
Yeah, so it's two things. One is, as Gina was just saying, it's about people and how we treat each other, how we think about each other. And that involves us being self-critical and having humility and listening. And then the other thing I'd pull out is the sense, it is about truth. And that comes back to honesty in ourselves and our relationships and what we're doing. And it's not easy, it's tough emotionally to everybody involved, and we have to respect that, but we've got to, respect each other.
Excellent, thank you, Neil. And Shaista, we'd like to listen to you.
Very few people say that, but I'll take that face value. I'm joking. So yeah, I agree with that. I agree that we have to have more honesty. We've got to have more uncomfortable conversations, which will then lead to action. And ultimately, this is about people, as other colleagues here have said. And it's also about, it's not just what's happening in a museum in one part of the city or another city or somewhere else in the world. It's about the impact it's having on people and generations of people as well in that space as well. So I think we just need to constantly remember that as well. And the culture wars have been mentioned a few times already today. They're real, and the impact on people's livelihoods, their mental well-being, their mental health, Nadine rightly mentioned that, and thanks for your work, Nadine, are very real. And we need to be vigilant about that as well. And we have to be far more braver in articulating the vision that we have and bringing people with us. But we also need to be better at showing solidarity to each other, but particularly those people who are going to be more vulnerable because of their identities, including their race.
Excellent. Thank you, Shaista. Really great. And Debs, from you?
Yes, thank you very much, everybody. One very quick point about the collections. I hadn't realised, I know they're massive and thing, but I hadn't realised that they would steal anything, like literally, like I don't know, the range of the objects. I hadn't realised. In terms, I think, of the culture wars, one thing, museums and these elite establishments do have a critical role to play. I think I sometimes want to name the culture wars the war against humanity, because it's, you know, because of the attack, the hatred that is being perpetrated, and it's horrendous. And so actually this is a really important piece of work to be doing. And final point is, what are the next steps? Like, we're getting involved now from Anti-Racist City, so we're keen to involve, because it is about the people, or it's about the history of us, the people. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much for that, Debs. So can I call on Nadine now for some final thoughts?
Yeah, I think I just echo a lot of what other people have said. I think the culture war thing, that people need to look after their own mental health. I also think it's important to develop a good PR/press approach to the press. You know if there's going to be a journalist watching, just things like that. Have an awareness of what may be said or what may be reported. And it's horrible to think about, but I do think publicity with these kind of things is really important. So, you know, I don't think it's a matter of toning down things. I just think it's about being strategic. Like, I'm a firm believer that we shouldn't compromise on the moral arguments for repatriation and restitution, 100%. But I also know that we live in a country where there is just this, particularly with Oxbridge, this appetite. I mean, today you have that stuff with the Queen portrait. There's this appetite to kind of stir this like hatred and anger and culture wars. So I think it's a matter of not straying away from the key principles, but also being strategic in how we speak about it, when we speak about it, who we speak about it to make sure that the message isn't lost. Because it's frustrating to feel like you have to like censor yourself a little bit, but I think also just in the interest of people's mental health, having a good strategy when it comes to dealing with press, I think is really important, just all around when it comes to the success of the campaign and also to individuals' mental health. And again, Theocratic Leader said, like, you know, the people of colour who are on the front line, they get the worst of it because you're accused of being un-British, you're accused of being ungrateful to this country, all that kind of stuff. So I think it's really important to show solidarity to the people of colour, particularly that are at the front of this, because we get the brunt of it. Yeah, but that's all I had to say, really.
Thanks, Nadine. Really useful tips there. And you being a freelance journalist yourself, you know very well the importance of a good press strategy. Monica, final word from you, please.
I think the road ahead is quite long, and I think that workshops and panels like today are the first good step. I'm looking forward to more exchanges and more community awareness. And my final word is that we also need to involve more artists and more popular artists. I think the discourse is still within academic circles. What we need to do is to popularize it more, so it gains momentum that forces the different institutions to take some real actions and steps.
Thank you for that, Monica. So I'm going to wrap up very unwillingly, because I could have these conversations just continue, but I'm going to have to wrap up this very rich and fulfilling panel discussion. I'm personally very struck by how we started off with objects, but then we moved on to people, we moved on to mental health, we moved on to ethics, we moved on to a whole range of social, cultural history. Debs raised the point about whose history is it? And so we really managed to see a broadening out of the different aspects that restitution work might take, which is amazing. Could I now invite, please, Professor Dan Hicks from the Pitt Rivers Museum and Onekachi Wambu of Afford to give us their concluding thoughts, and perhaps to tell us also about what's next. What are the forthcoming workshops going to be about? Thank you.
Absolutely, yeah, thanks so much. Actually, while I'm talking, I wasn't going to share an image, but if you will bear with me, I'm just going to, hopefully you can all see that that image. It's really just to respond to a point made by Nadine, which was about Neville, who was this man who gave the cockerel to Cambridge and to Jesus. Here is his front room in Weybridge in the south of England, with actually a number of these other objects that he took as a soldier, you know, in that attack in Benin. So you've got the leopards either side, there, if you look hard in the middle, you can see the hip ornament masks that are against the fireplace. At the top, there is a carved ivory. And I think the presence of these objects in a domestic space actually reminds us of the ubiquity of how, you know, empire, how objects that were taken, how the dispossessions in terms of the military histories that we're talking about here, you know, was everywhere. I mean, there was a lot of it, and it was intimately sort of in the household. It was in the college as well as in the museum. And I think what that means to some degree, a part of the importance of the conversations that we've been having, and all of the great sort of ways in which we've moved from anti-racism to talking about the histories of objects, to the museums actually listing objects and making that information available. I think it sort of reminds us that a part of the reason we're having this conversation in our museums at the moment is that we're at a moment for anti-racism where we're recognizing that institutional racism is here with us in the present, you know, not only in museums and in the universities, but of course across sort of culture. But maybe we see it actually more in the museums, because I think a part of what we're realizing is that racism has a history, and that history is actually linked up with empire and with these sorts of later phases of empire, which is when all this military looting was sort of happening. So, I mean, we're ready in anthropology, obviously, to talk about, and have been for a long time, about anthropology's relationship with racist science. But we haven't really started the conversation over the role of sort of culture. So really this is a direct link, I think, to wider anti-racism work. So the restitution conversation, I think, I mean, what we've been learning today is that here in the UK, and I will defend the notion of devolving, if I may. I understand the point Neil was making, but actually moving it away from only being a conversation about the British Museum, about the government's sort of attitude sort of to this, having these conversations in a series of different localized ways, in the ways that we've tried to do today, hearing from the town as well as the gown, thinking about how this works out in an Oxbridge sort of context as well as more generally. So I'm just going to finish up there, and just to underline that we're going to move on next on to Manchester in order to talk about archaeological taking. We're moving then on to other partner museums to talk about human remains, to talk about objects relating to sovereignty, objects relating to belief, and objects relating to natural history. So I'm going to stop there, but hand over to Onikachi as well.
Thanks, Dan. And I totally agree with you about the moment. In 1994, I began an African Remembrance Day because it was important to remember all the victims of empire and slavery. And we started in 94 because it was a momentous occasion with the end of apartheid in South Africa, and we realized that that moment and that age of institutional, where Africans had been institutionally and codified as second-class citizens and inferior, was over. So this big moment in history was over, and we expected that we were now going to look back at all what had happened during that moment, because the battles had been about removing the next indignity, and the last one was obviously apartheid in South Africa. And so it was clear that from 95 onwards that we were going to start looking back. And we've been waiting, held Remembrance Days every year since then, and we've been waiting for this momentum to build, and we're seeing now, as Sam said, that we're looking at the role of empire and how it institutionalized and codified inferiority across the board, and we're now looking at it in the sphere of culture. So it's really, really important that restitution and this momentum for restitution is going to be unstoppable. But I wanted to thank all the contributors today. Very rich discussions, as has been mentioned already, and a lot of the new information presented. It was wonderful seeing the range of the material in the Pitt Rivers collection, for example, especially the brass hip, which was my favorite, and the ceremonial sword. We look forward to sharing this on our own Return of the Icons Facebook page, where we're now tracking looted pieces in Western institutions. And we hope that you out there will share these wonderful pieces much more widely when they become available. There's nothing, as we've discovered on the Facebook page, like engaging with the items to really see their power and enjoy their beauty. We also have seen wonderful examples of return from Aberdeen, Manchester, Cambridge, and Rhodes Island. And also this concept that I think is a really powerful one of not just the legal title, but the moral title, and how we can begin to use that in our campaigns. And this was a really important distinction to make in driving forward future campaigns. So we thank all those really incredible examples of actual restitution happening. And then the connection between town and gown has been also very, very clear today. And also in that, what we mean by devolution and how we connect ongoing anti-racist struggles to what's going on in the cultural institutions. And that's really important if we're going to build momentum for this work, given, as everybody has mentioned, the broader context that is going on with the culture wars. And then we heard perspectives from Egypt and South Africa, and those African perspectives were really, really important here. And the warnings about the dangers of restitution as a new form of colonization, in which Africans are now facing, in terms of the new scramble for the continent that we're seeing. And also the dangers of fetishizing the objects over people. So people at the end were key to all of this. And finally, the importance of restitution of agency and knowledge production, and also restitution that brings back women as in terms of that agency as well. Ultimately, this was a broader discussion, as I say, about the role of culture and the role of the museum in the academy in the 21st century. The restitution momentum, as I say, is unstoppable, and these are things that all of us are going to have to engage with, because we are in that historical moment, and people of African descent and other people in the South, and particularly people of African descent, are now looking back at the role that we have played in the construction of the West, and the fact that we have suffered a lot in that process, and we want to understand some of that in terms of what has happened over the last 400 years. We look forward to the next engagement in the Devolving Restitution Roadshow. As Dana said, we're going to other cities. And I'm just going to end, because what you've heard is a journalist's summary of events, but we are now going to hear, and I think it's always better to hear a poet's perspective on understanding. So we're going to hear from our poet, who will give us his take in much more beautiful language, and I think hopefully will stir more from us in terms of our imagination and also our activism on these really important issues. So I'll hand back to Dia, and for you to introduce our poet to end the event. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan and Onyekachi. And as Onyekachi mentioned, we have our second poet of the day now, who's going to take center stage. And I'd like to introduce her briefly. She is our poetic chronicler of the day. So she's been sitting in throughout panel 1 and panel 2. And she's been commissioned for us by Poet in the City. Her name is Mumtaza Mehri. And Mumtaza is the former Young People's Laureate for London and a columnist in residence at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art's Open Space. Mumtaza has been listening to our speakers in both panels, and really we wanted to give her the last word. So I'm going to say my thank yous and my summing up here. A huge thank you to all our excellent speakers. We have had a truly stellar list of speakers here, and for all their contributions, a huge thank you for everybody who's joined in, both via Zoom as well as the YouTube link. And we will end this session and both panels after Mumtaza has finished her poetic chronicle, and we will finish recording once this poetic chronicle has been read out loud. So Mumtaza, it's over to you now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dia. I'd like to just be thankful and just express my gratitude for the perspectives that everybody's shared today. And I've learned so much. This is a sort of a matter or like concerns that I've had burgeoning interest in for a very long time. But this has just really elevated my own understanding of it, and it's given me so many different wormholes to go down. To hear it from your perspective and also to hear everyone's research has been really an honor. And it's no pressure for me, but I have to end with a poem. And I hope that in some way you can see some of what you may have mentioned or some of the points that have been brought up reflected in the poem, but also it can sort of encapsulate these sort of like greater issues in a way that speaks to some kind of, I would hope, essential truth that can be found in the poem. So the poem, which I literally finished a minute ago, so it's hot off the press. The poem is called Behind the Glass, a Contestation, and it goes a little something like this. Once we thought poets to be the custodians of the past, the narrators of its labyrinthine passages. We wanted to sit at the feet of those who spun commonality from the endless thread of interpretation. We thought we needed someone else to do the work of remembering. We did not trust ourselves. That was how we were trained. Knowledge was a wielded weapon. We felt its dull weight lacking somewhere in the twist of gut. What do you call this searching to be undone? A younger me, none the wiser, sought the quicker route there, the hum of the 98 bus towards the pillared vaults of a museum, a national one, its chalked white of grand design and delusions. I let the atrium swallow me, guide my prickling curiosity towards the collections bearing the names that so easily tumbled like fresh water from my tongue. I studied the crescent-shaped platform, a missing rib, an etched geometry carved into this fine-grained wood. Cool air stung the cheek, distracted from the angled circumference of an object's base, the gravitational pull of its simmering history. Hagar, the description reads, a traditional headrest, found, acquired, Somalia, category, sub-Saharan Africa. Destinies collapsed together into a small Gothic typeface, spelled right at least. Category as cage, confine, enclosure. One acquisition borrowed from another, the first rupture, the first disappearing given a date of 1954. 6 restless years before what we have come to know as independence, a process still fiercely unfurling, like the starred flags foremothers waved with their outspread arms, as gold bracelets slid down the silk of their wrists. 6 restless years before the union of trusts and territories, the stitching together of imposed borders, of drawn fault lines made by those who would claim a river for themselves, name it after a queen who would die before seeing it. I think of the nomad who rested his head here, the pillowed halo of his hair, her neck, against its single column splendor. At night, it stopped slumber, guarded against the night's uncertainties, became a symbol of a people who had every reason to sleep with one eye open. The description is bare, bleached of a context learned at the aching feet of grandmothers. I am armed with a knowledge I do not know what to do with. By the glaring exit sign, a jostle for donations, would my dropped pennies liberate me of my predictable longings, embellish the display with kinder sentences? Years later, in another moment of suspension, I scavenged for further scatterings in the university library, inspecting the parameters of a country, a continent's fracture between its shelves. Again, I have come here to be undone, expecting to undo something else. My own lightheaded arrogance magnified by the singular promise of Rome's afternoon sun trickling through the stained windows. Neutrality taunts. I am pinning down the butterfly, prodding at an archive which has no living place for us, a place beyond the parody of shrunken heads, the fragile bones of children, a femur of a bombing victim here, a two-handled jade cup there. Objects of the objectified, they exceed their life here. Who refuses to share the monopoly of memory? Oxford, London, Philadelphia, Paris. Is the universal elastic enough to bear the fullness of grief? The exotic is full-throated in its silence. It belongs to the whole world, meaning it doesn't belong to you, meaning nothing belongs to you. The rules are not yours to play by. The well is empty, the cast set, Cape to Cairo, molded in the appetites of a primly grasping Victorian age of Maxine gums and parasols, the daintiness of practiced violence and infinite greed, the roll call of revolving characters, businessman, slaver, missionary, explorer, adventurer, cartographer, soldier, Napoleon's art advisor transformed into a museum director, Egyptophile spoils of occupation, chroniclers of Caesars of land and mind. Who rewrites the script, gives objects new lives to breathe, new words to speak? What can we gain by giving something up? Is it a loss if it flows both ways, or is it something closer to justice? Thank you for having me.